Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thoughts. Now let's start the video.
Aelor Targaryen had often wondered what ran through a man's mind when he crested a ridge to face the steel of an enemy host. He'd known the feeling in small portions, experience from the parchments in Bronzegate and other skirmishes, but the slaughter at King's Landing had been scattered and erratic. He'd never beheld disciplined lines of enemy armor stretching almost as far as his eyes could see. Now he had. The rebel forces were exactly where the king had said they would be. Facing the loyalist across the River Trident, the prancing stag of Baratheon flying over the spears directly center of the unnamed ford, higher than normal due to the recent heavy rains but still easily manageable. Aelor sat warrior 400 yards off, a few dozen yards out of edge of the tree line bordering the field leading to the waters, the army forming up behind him. And even from that distance, he saw the figure that he had centered nearly all of his hatred around. Robert Baratheon sat a fittingly white stallion under the largest of the black stag on yellow field banners, an antlered helm and his impressive stature singling him out even among the forest of armor and helms. "I've been hunting you for months. How wonderful it is to finally bump into you again." Aelor followed the line of enemies to his right, spying the iron studs on bronze field of Royce, the 6 bells on purple field of Belmore, the silver arrows on brown field of Hunter, and predominate to them all the soaring blue falcon on white moon on sky blue field of Arryn. To his left, the enemy's right, he recognized the giant in chains on red field of Umber, the merman on blue field of Manderley, the flayed man on pink field of Bolton, and of course the running grey direwolf on white field of Stark. "Ah, brilliant, we have a full house. We wouldn't want anybody to miss the party now, would we?" The king's sad, melancholy voice spoke to Aelor's left, Rhaegar pulling his equally large, dark stallion to a halt beside Warrior. "I see they were expecting us." Aelor grunted his agreement, putting aside his differences with his brother as well as he could to focus on the upcoming battle. He gestured towards the forest of spears forming the front lines, swordsmen behind them. The enemy was massed heavily in the center, wisely making their line the strongest where the Targaryens would have to cross the river. While the ford was fairly wide, its heavy use clearing much of the land fronting it as well as smoothing the surface of the river underneath the shallow water to sand and small stones, there was still only a limited amount of space that the loyalist would have to cross. "I'm sure they have archers ready to rain death on us once we're in the midst of the ford." Barristan the Bold, mounted to the left of the king on a stallion as white as his armor, nodded. "It's what we would have done in their place, your grace. Once we're across the water their flanks will certainly swoop in on our own. We'll be fighting a horseshoe." Aelor stretched his arms, flexing and relaxing his hands in rapid succession. He felt the pre-battle adrenaline already coursing through his veins, the anticipation of what was to come heightening all of his senses. "Do you suppose Prince Oberyn made it into position?" Jon Connington, mounted on a stallion as red as his hair, held his helm shaped to look like a screeching griffin under an arm, as did both the Targaryen brothers and Barristan. Aelor laughed shortly. "Trust me, Connington, Oberyn will be there." Rhaegar looked to his brother, face slightly chastising. "I still believe it should be you in his place." Aelor shook his head, meeting his brother's identical eyes and holding them steadily. "As I've said before, I've been fighting those bastards since the start of the war, and my armor and helm are quite recognizable. They would notice if I wasn't here, and since everyone from Robert Baratheon to the High Septon know I wouldn't miss this fight for all the gold in Casterly Rock, it would alert them to what's truly happening. My place is here. Besides," Aelor added on as he patted his stallion's armored neck, "Warrior will want in on the action from the beginning." Rhaegar sighed, shaking his head in exasperation. "Why am I not surprised?" Rhaegar looked back to the enemy, taking a deep breath. "I suppose it is time. Jon Barristan, give us a moment." Connington obeyed without hesitation, whirling his red stallion to gallop back towards the main lines, men from the Reach, the Crownlands, the Westerlands and Dorne all preparing for the massive battle that was soon to come. Barristan followed him slightly slower, clearly unwilling to leave the king when so near the enemy but duty-bound to obey. Randyll Tarly had the infantry, ranging from inexperienced levies to battle-tested retainers. Rhaegar and Barristan were to lead the second wave of attackers, once the vanguard had gained a foothold on the opposite bank. As for Aelor himself, well, he was to lead that vanguard as he always did. Not even Rhaegar Targaryen could dissuade him from that. "I should lead this charge, Aelor," Rhaegar protested again, despite knowing it was a useless venture. "I am to die here on this very day. Nothing you can do will change that." "Maybe you're right," Aelor said, facing his brother again. "Maybe you will die here, though I don't store much by your visions. I intend to see that you don't bring the entirety of the army down with you. If you die in the initial volley, half of the men will turn and flee before they even manage to draw an ounce of the enemy's blood. Better the king lose his hand than his head. You mean more to the men than I do, perhaps, but you are their hope for the future. You are their king, and I'm leading this bloody charge no matter your complaints." Rhaegar shook his head. "Sometimes I wonder which of us thinks he's king. Obviously it's you, or we wouldn't be here in the first place." The king of the Iron Throne held his brother's gaze for a long moment before holding out his hand almost tentatively. "I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, baby brother, but you're still my blood and I love you." Aelor eyed the king's extended hand, all of his brother's prophecies and blunders flashing before him. But close on their heels were memories from when they were children, of Rhaegar's brightest moments, from their escapades hiding in the secret passages from their tutors and the countless trouble they had once stirred up. And Aelor reached out his gauntlet to take the king's, squeezing it tightly. No words came to him, so he only nodded. Rhaegar nodded back, giving his brother one last sad smile before he wheeled the stallion around and galloped towards the main lines. Aelor took a deep breath, letting his eyes focus on the enemy preparing for the charge they knew was coming. His adrenaline was increasing, as was his anticipation. "It is time to do what I do best." Aelor lowered his white flame helm over his head and set his broad shoulders, funneling his increasing energy into his voice, roaring loud enough that he knew without a doubt every soldier at the ford, loyalist or traitor, could hear him. "Vanguard!" With a roar of their own that Aelor felt even through the hundreds of pounds of horseflesh underneath him, his knights trotted forwards, lances angled upwards. His own veterans, bolstered by the best knights chosen from the entirety of the loyalist army, took to his sides, forming the wedge they had employed so often, both successfully and less so. "I needn't worry, there's a river to either side. Even Selwyn fucking Tarth couldn't flank me here." The ford was only a few dozen yards wide, Aelor's men keeping the wedge rather short, men filling in the space behind the front lines. They all knew they were charging into the teeth of the wolves, and each man knew he was likely to die, but they formed up on the prince they had followed many times before. Aelor took the lance Alaric brought him, pleased to see how well the armor he had commissioned for the lad fit his lanky form. "Are you with me, Alaric?" The languid lad gave the same answer he always did, smiling broadly. "To the death, your grace. You're a good lad." Aelor turned to his other side, speaking before he even laid eyes on the man beside him. It didn't make any difference, really. There was no doubt in his mind who it would be. "And you, Ren." The Lord of Hollard Hall smiled through the visor of his spiked helm. Aelor couldn't really see it, but he knew. "I was there when this war started. I aim to be here when it ends." Aelor smacked the side of his arm against his breastplate, lance stabbing into the air as he did so. "Strong shield." Rickard did the same, stronger sword. The Targaryen prince kicked warrior into action, riding down the front of his line to the left before doubling back to the right, standing in his saddle and plunging his lance into the air. His knights repeated the gesture, roaring battle cries, reminding the dragon of Duskendale of that time a few months and a dozen lifetimes ago on the parchments. Aelor waited until they died down slightly before speaking, saying the only thing he knew to. "Need I say a damn thing?" His men thundered out in response, warrior adding his own bellow to the cacophony of sound. "Well then, lads, let's get to it. Fire and blood. Fire and blood." With his house's words ringing in his ears, Aelor Targaryen kicked his stallion's flanks, 4 hooves and 1,000 voices carrying the dragon of Duskendale into the heart of the stag. Whatever he thought of the Targaryens, he couldn't deny they made splendid sights. Even from this distance, behind the lines of thousands of spears and swords, Eddard could see the king and his brother as they rode ahead of the seemingly endless lines of loyalist men marching clear of the forest. The king of the Iron Throne sat a black stallion, the rubies arranged to portray the 3-headed Targaryen dragon sparkling in the new sunlight. Beside him, seated on another black stallion that Targaryen warriors seemed to love, sat a broader, taller figure, armor less ornate but no less striking. Aelor Targaryen, the dragon of Duskendale, looked every bit the warrior rumors had him to be. "Look at them," Robert nearly spat, antlered helm already lowered over his head. Eddard noticed his friend's hands were twitching, wanting nothing more than to grab the spiked hammer slung across their owner's back. Murderers and buggering thieves, yet they have a full army behind them ready to die for their sins. They accepted our field of battle, Eddard said with a touch of respect. Of course they did. Robert's voice was as clear as Eddard had heard it in days. They have to bring their rebellious dogs to heel. The brother will lead the charge, Jon Arryn spoke certainly from the other side of Robert. Cavalry straight up the gauntlet into the center. Once they hit us, crash in on their flanks. Robert, whatever his faults, was in his element on the battlefield. The rapist will likely bring the infantry up to press the progress made by the other silver-headed git. We'll deal as much damage as we can before I bring in the second line for a counter. Ned turned his Garen slightly to observe the thousands of mounted men, splendidly colored Valemen knights on barded coursers, Riverlander warriors defending their homeland, and Northmen heavy cavalry in boiled leather and furs, all ready to lower lance and strike once the loyalist infantry was engaged. Behind them, the reserve force of infantry lie in wait under the command of his good father Hoster Tully, ready to both counter unforeseen threats and shore up the advantage their own cavalry would gain. The sight of the leaping trout adorning Lord Tully's helm brought with it the thought of Catelyn, a surge of protectiveness washing over Ned. I wonder if she's given birth yet. It's still too early, I imagine, but what if Eddard decided to forgo that line of thought and foolish worry before it could take root and distract him from the battle at hand, deciding to focus all of his energy on the nearing clash that may well mean life or death for his child, born or no. Many of our men will get caught up in the charge. I know our reasoning, but it still does not sit well with me. They know their duty, Ned, Robert consoled. They're going to do theirs so we may do our own. Vanguard, the roar from across the river echoed even over the creak of leather and rattle of steel surrounding Eddard, and with a cry hundreds of knights rode forward to form up on the second son of Aerys. It is time. Eddard remarked to the other leaders of the rebellion, the men he considered family, even as Aelor Targaryen's knights roared like demons. We will see each other again soon, Robert said, clasping Ned and Jon Arryn both on the shoulder before riding back towards the lines of knights he was to lead. Nothing more was said. Nothing more was needed. It's a good day for a fight, Great John Umber called as Ned returned moments later to the center of his bannermen, smiling hugely. Umbers do everything hugely. The giant on their sigil is quite suiting. We're soon to find out, Ned replied simply. Any other comments, inspiring words, or cryptic predictions were lost as the Targaryen knights cried out once more. Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell in the north, watched on with both anticipation and a fear in his gut that only fools didn't feel. It is time, for father, for Brandon, for Lyanna. Aelor Targaryen rode down the lines of his men, standing in his saddle and thrusting his warlance into the air as he called out to his men, the wall of armor returning his cries. Then with one final bellow of his house words, the dragon of Duskendale charged, flying towards Eddard and his men with the thunder of thousands of hooves accompanying him. Warrior roared, barreling forwards much faster than a horse his size should be able to with a brawny, armored knight on their back, much less when armored themselves. Aelor wondered with that odd sense of detached thought he had during battle, if there had ever been an animal more suited to war than the destrier carrying his dragonlord towards the lines of enemy steel. We're alike, it seems. We thrive in battle and chafe in peace. Several dozen yards before they reached the waters of the ford he heard the distinctive whistles, knowing what it was without any need of seeing it. Shields, he shouted, bringing his own above his head as his men did the same, some having recognized what was happening and given the command before even the prince. The arrows all seemed to fall at once, a thick mass of sharpened steel digging into dirt, shield, horseflesh, and man. The familiar but always disturbing screech of wounded horses filled the air even as Aelor felt the impact of a few arrows digging into his shield, and saw another deflect off the chainmail blanket covering Warrior's black neck. Aelor barely had time to check that Alaric was still beside him, 3 arrow shafts sticking out of the squire's own shield, before Warrior's hooves hit water, the deafening rumble of the earth turning into an even louder splash of water. Lance, the dragon prince called, though he doubted he could be heard. It wasn't like his men needed the reminder, as they were nearing the enemy's spears rapidly. Aelor lowered his own lance as Warrior bore down on the unwavering line of Stormlander spearmen. We're fighting brave men. Too bad they are all going to die. A warlance was 8 feet of hardened wood tipped with deadly sharp steel, and when wielded by a strong man atop a destrier running at full speed, there was no armor known to man that could stop it outright. It could be deflected, however, knocked aside by a shield or guided into a glancing blow by armor if the man on the receiving end knew what he was doing. It was for that reason, aided by the need to satisfy the terrifying black hate Aelor Targaryen carried into battle, that the dragon of Duskendale drove his warlance into the face of the spearman to his front, taking advantage of the man's half-helm by plunging the steel point into his eye socket. Aelor's lance splintered as the spearman vaulted backwards into his fellows, a foot of fire-hardened ash jutting out of the now very dead man's right eye. The Dragon Lord instinctually used the remnants of the lance as a club, bringing the black and white painted ashwood down onto the helm of another footman even as he knocked aside a spear on the opposite side with his shield. Realizing that without its point the lance was rather useless, awkward to swing and too light to cause much damage, the Dragon Lord threw it at the same man, testing its prospects as a blunted javelin even as he drew his sword. Poor. Looks like swordwork it is. The effect of hundreds of mounted armored men crashing into you went beyond the physical dangers, the shock breeding panic among inexperienced soldiers. Even so, there was no shortage of enemies to fight, and by the time the Northmen and Valemen expectedly crashed into the sides of Aelor's men, the dragon of Duskendale's sword was bloody from crossguard to point. Warrior kept his hooves as the two drove deeper into the thick crowd of enemies. The war horse managing to avoid the forest of death in a way Aelor, while grateful, found somewhat eerily human-like. This horse is smarter than most of the nobles in Westeros. It was true that trying to kill a knight's horse was considered dishonorable, but Aelor knew as well as anyone that honor was the first casualty of war. The Black Destrier somehow managed to stay alive, however, and for not the first time Aelor prayed to the Seven that the animal would make it out alive. Funny. I should be praying for my men, for my brother, and here I am praying for a bloody horse. Aelor didn't feel guilty. He liked his horse, something he couldn't say about most of the humans he knew. Fighting men on foot from atop a horse made a knight a target, especially when that knight was clearly a Targaryen prince, but Aelor was no stranger to fighting multiple enemies at once. Neither was warrior. As for every man the Lord of Duskendale slew, the stallion sank his teeth into or kicked another, trampling over dead and wounded men alike with no sense of discrimination. As Aelor roared, the battle lust flowing heavy alongside the blood of old Valyria, the horse did the same. As man and mount were finally slowed to a near stop, Aelor batted a sword aside and opened its owner's throat, using his advantage of height atop the stallion's tall back to swing down with heavy force. Hacking into shield and flesh and bone, he felt more than saw Rhaegar and the infantry arrive, the massive blades that had been focused solely on him dispersing as their wielders suddenly had an influx of new Targaryen soldiers to worry about. Aelor knew in the back of his mind that the battle was spreading all across this side of the river, the patch of ground fronting the bloody ford not nearly large enough for tens of thousands of men to wage war. But to him the world was reduced to the few feet around himself and his mount. There were no tactics or stratagems useful here. This was an all-out bloody brawl, where a man's birth made no difference concerning who lived and who died. Aelor knew without a doubt that nobles were dying the same as small folk, peasant and lord bleeding out in churned-up mud alongside one another in an odd sense of unity that was never realized in life. Those lucky enough to still be alive and on their feet slew others, dropping more and more corpses to the ground in deepening piles to accompany the dying in their last moments. It was a bloody, awful process, nothing like the songs and stories, the stench of blood, death, piss and shit filling the air accompanied by clangs of steel, shouts of elation and despair and horror and the haunting screams of the dying. Time meant nothing. It never did in battle, other than the truth that many men no longer had any in this world. Aelor fought, swinging and stabbing and gouging for seconds or minutes or days. He shouted as he decapitated a peasant with a spear, cursed as he nearly lost his seat atop warrior, and roared as he killed and killed and killed. Aelor didn't see the charge coming until it was too late. By the time he looked up, all he could see was a knight with a blue anchor on his surcoat and a lance. Not the banner he rode under, or the men to his sides. The dragon of Duskendale brought his shield up, fear and rage and battlelust all bursting out in a choked cry, as the lance slammed into the oak and banded steel shield. The force was like a tidal wave, carrying the big Targaryen up and out of his saddle, the lance splintering as Aelor found himself catapulted over warriors' haunches and into the mud and blood below. Whatever notions Eddard Stark had had of war were complete and utter shit. There was nothing honorable about this disorganized melee, men having at each other with everything from swords to rocks. A peasant levy crouched over a downed knight with a boar on his surcoat, smashing a head-sized stone into his face again and again and again, not stopping even though the knight's legs had stopped twitching long ago. Eddard couldn't watch long, finding another knight, this one without a sigil on his green and white surcoat, charging down on him. Eddard blocked his overhead blow with ice, the smoky Valyrian steel of the greatsword he never thought he'd wield, making the knight's blade spark, before forcing his opponent's blade up and slicing ice across his chest. The man's armor took most of the backfoot blow, but even the castle-forged steel he wore couldn't stop the ancient spellbound steel from chopping down into his shoulder. The man dropped to his knees, the Lord of Winterfell staying his killing blow for a moment. But with a gurgled cry, the knight tried again to stab the Warden of the North. Ned avoided the nameless warrior's blade and brought his own down, putting a stop to his weakening attacks permanently. Beside him, Greatjon Umber boomed out a laugh, slitting a Reachman's throat. He'd stuck by Ned's side the entire battle, dismounting when Ned's own Garren took a spear and slogging it out on foot with his liege lord. He'd taken turns between laughing deafeningly and singing a tavern song at the top of his lungs, shouting about a whore's tits even as he plunged his blade through a footman's gut. On his other side, little Howland Reed fought on valiantly, the Cranogman wielding a small trident with unerring speed and accuracy, while periodically stopping to fire darts from the blowgun he stubbornly refused to abandon. Exactly when the Lord of the Neck had appeared beside him, the Lord Paramount of the North couldn't say, but the tiny man was more than holding his own. Aelor Targaryen's charge had hit hard and fast, the Dragon of Duskendale unleashing a level of hell Ned Stark hadn't known existed. His brother the King's charge was somewhat less splendid though no less effective, forcing the rebel forces back, more and more loyalist knights and men splashing across the ford to make war. Eddard caught glances of the King of the Iron Throne periodically, dragonwing helm distinctive, the white armor of a Kingsguard close to him. Even on a riverbank surrounded by tens of thousands of men, he could easily be distinguished. So when Robert's charge swept across the battlefield, overrunning whatever forward progress had been made by the Loyalists in the center, Eddard knew exactly where he was going. Antlered helm every bit as distinctive as Rhaegar Targaryen's dragon wings. Robert Baratheon looked like a god among men, swinging his massive hammer like it weighed no more than wooden toy, sending dead men flying all around him, and heading straight for Rhaegar Targaryen. "My Lord Stark!" a voice shouted, and Eddard withdrew ice from a man's chest. He didn't even remember putting it there as he turned to the voice. A knight of the Vale, 3 red forts on his surcoat, staggered up to him, gesticulating wildly towards the forest 100 yards beyond. His left arm was hanging from his shoulder by a stubborn few ligaments, flopping lifelessly as he neared. The rear. Ned Stark looked from the horrifying appearance of the man towards the rear lines, and felt his blood freeze even colder than it normally ran. Hundreds of men in orange and red, mounted atop horses that could only be the infamous Dornish sand steeds or sprinting forward on foot carrying throwing javelins, were emerging from the woods, on our side of the river. Eddard could only watch in terrified awe as the Dornish vaulted into action, aiming for the rear of what remained of the rebel lines. His good father Hoster Tully was rushing to meet them, but Ned could see that Tully had too few men. The Warden of the North looked once more towards his best friend, the Stag of Storm's End, slaughtering his way towards the Dragon of the Throne before turning. "Lord Umber, the rear, pull our men back to the rear." He repeated the call, Umber and others taking it up, a horn starting to blow to alert the rebel forces of the new threat. As Ned Stark's Northmen turned to meet the new threat, their liege lord gripping ice tightly and leading his men towards the enemy. "May the old gods grant you strength, old friend." How Aelor Targaryen was alive he couldn't say. When a man loses his feet in battle, he is finished. Vulnerable to every enemy soldier in the vicinity. A peasant with a dagger now had the advantage over a king with a longsword, able to slip the blade into joints in armor before a downed man could regain his feet. So when Aelor landed atop the mud and bloody corpses behind Warrior, he had assumed himself dead, enemy cavalry stomping over the dead all around him as their infantry closed back in. He'd thought of Aaliyah, of Aegon and Rhaenys, and wondered if they would forgive him for leaving them and dying on this god-forsaken riverbank. But the blade had never came, the blow of steel sinking into his neck never landing. And here he was, still breathing. When the Dragon of Duskendale sat up on his rear, he saw why. Alaric Langward, while undisciplined, had been gifted with a sword even when he'd first began squiring for the Dragon of Duskendale, raw talent that few ever possessed, needing only a little refined training from superior swordsmen to turn the lanky youth truly deadly. Aelor and Barristan the Bold had seen to that training, and it was paying off tenfold now. The Dragonlord Squire danced, spinning and slashing, removing one knight's hand and landing a blow perfectly in the joint of another's armor, standing over his mentor and friend like storm end against a monsoon. The boy fought like a man possessed, slamming his shield into a man's face before opening his throat. No matter the enemies that came against him, the squire fought on stubbornly, never wielding an inch, keeping the vultures from descending on the dragon. Aelor watched in awe for a substantial amount of time before it dawned on him that he should probably stand up. Stand up the Lord of Duskendale did, joining his squire against the onslaught of enemy swords. He'd lost his shield in the fall, the oak and steel useless anyway with a broken lance sticking out of it. So Aelor felt free to use his armored left fist as another weapon. He punched and gouged, using the armor of his forearm to deflect steel away as best it could. A bellow caught Aelor's ear in a lull in the number of enemies around him, one sound among hundreds in the din of battle, but Aelor turned back towards the ford, the cry catching his attention entirely in a way only the fates could. There in the center of the blood-red waters of the ford, dismounted but both very much still alive, were Robert Baratheon and Rhaegar Targaryen. Warhammer whistled and sword shrieked, two kings going head-to-head in the middle of a raging battle. Part of Aelor's mind registered that most of his men had been forced back into the ford, and their original side of the river, he and Alaric being two of a few dozen stragglers still left among the heaps of dead and dying on the opposite bank. Another part registered the Dornish arriving. Men from the rebel reserve and all along their lines turning to take the gift Prince Oberyn Martell was about to unleash on them. But the main part of Aelor's mind saw his brother the king locked in battle with a man who hated him every bit as fiercely as Aelor hated that man. Rhaegar's premonition of his own death rang in Aelor's ears, fear that it might come true overtaking the Lord of Duskendale. Whatever thoughts Aelor had had that the Seven Kingdoms might be better off with Rhaegar dead were suddenly nowhere to be found, an overwhelming sense to protect his blood overruling whatever other thoughts Aelor might have ever had. Before he knew it, Aelor Targaryen was running. He cut down 1-3-5 men as he fought, barely noticing the faces or the lives they entailed as he crossed blades, and left them dying and dead in the bloody mud. All Aelor could see was the king of the Iron Throne and the man whose woman he had stolen waging their private war in the middle of a much larger one, trading blows at a savage pace. Aelor fought his way towards them, cutting through the bloody melee to try and reach his brother and king's side. The Dragon of Duskendale had seen no sign of Barristan, the famous Kingsguard knight nowhere to be found. But he had no time to worry for the man who had treated him like his own son all of Aelor's life. All he had time to worry for was the brother that the Dragon Lord somehow knew was about to die. A Northman wielding 2 axes with 3 buckets sewn into the furs covering his chest met the second son of Ares as he reached the ford, the water running as red as roses in the summer, choked full of corpses. The Northerner was big and strong, and unbelievably fast for a man his size. Aelor found himself having to focus on the task at hand when one of the axes nearly buried itself into his forehead. The prince's instinctive step back all that saved him. The Northerner gave the Targaryen no time to gather himself, coming on in a flurry of axes and roars that put even Aelor's to shame. The Targaryen prince backpedaled, barely keeping his feet under him as he warded off the axemen's attacks. I really miss my shield right now. He had no defense beside batting the axe away with his sword and dancing from side to side, unable to swing several pounds of oak and banded steel as a second weapon. A shield was meant as a defense, but Aelor Targaryen had always been unconventional, preferring to wield his defense as an offense, preferring to be the aggressor. But right now he needed a shield for its 7-cent purpose, because Buckets was much better at dual-wielding weapons than anyone had any right to be. It was hard for Aelor to be the aggressor when he was barely managing to stay alive. Aelor jumped to the side, nearly finding himself dead when he tripped over a corpse, or maybe just a wounded man. Aelor didn't bother to see which, going to one knee as the Northerner loomed overhead. Aelor managed to dive out of the way, getting his feet under him again in time to ward off Bucket's next attack. The big hairy man was growing frustrated, snarling like a mad dog as he relentlessly attacked the Targaryen prince, never giving a thought to defense as he swung again and again, focusing solely on splitting the dragon spawn in front of him in two. That's when it clicked in Aelor's mind. As Buckets raised his right axe again, left already diving in, Aelor did perhaps the dumbest thing he had done in a long line of recklessness. The Dragon of Duskendale completely ignored the axe in Bucket's left hand, instead driving his sword forward as hard as his adrenaline-fueled body could. The prince's blade sank to the crossguard in the Northerner's stomach, Bucket's face going from enraged to surprised in the blink of an eye. The axe in his right hand remained stationary, the Northerner's eyes staring into Aelor's through the visor, as the Dragonlord withdrew his sword and plunged it again into the big man's chest. Bucket sank to his knees, never looking away, neither fear nor hatred in his dimming gaze but acceptance, as if the man was at peace dying in calf-high water turned red with blood hundreds of miles from home. As the Northerner's body slipped off his blade with a sickening slunk, Aelor realized that Buckets was at peace with death. a braver man than I. For the first time in his long line of killing, the second son of Aerys felt guilt. The Lord of Duskendale shook the feeling off as soon as it came, however, turning back towards the duel he had spent so long fighting to reach. He knew even as it happened that he would never in all his days forget the overwhelming numbness he felt as he turned to see the spike of Robert Baratheon's hammer drive into his brother's chest, scattering the rubies that adorned the King of the Iron Throne's armor into the shallow water of the ford. Barristan Selmy had accomplished many great deeds in his life, from slaying the last of the Blackfires in the Stepstones to scaling the walls of Duskendale to save King Aerys Targaryen, but the truth of the matter was that he was an incompetent shame of a Kingsguard. Words could not describe the feeling of guilt of and failure that accompanied the colossal boom of Robert Baratheon's warhammer scattering the rubies in Rhaegar's armor, the King of the Iron Throne sinking into the red water of the ford alongside so many of his men and enemies. Half of the men on both sides had seemed to stop fighting to watch the duel, and when Rhaegar Targaryen fell, Barristan felt the spirit go out of the loyalist, much as his own had fled. Men who moments ago had been fighting fiercely turned and fled, the rebel forces giving out a great war cry as their new king raised his hammer. The body of the old collapsed in the clogged ford at his feet. In the odd way Sir Barristan had learned the Seven functioned in battle, he heard the roar of black rage over the cries of elation by the rebels and the footfalls of fleeing men as the loyalist army fled around the man in white armor. So did Baratheon. As the new Kingslayer turned to face it, Aelor Targaryen was suddenly everywhere at once, raining blows down on a now stumbling Robert Baratheon and cursing with every clang of steel. Two knights tried to intervene, coming in on Aelor's sides, but before Barristan could really grasp what was happening, both lay dead, the Dragon of Duskendale once again forcing Robert Baratheon back with sheer savagery. Baratheon had looked implacable when he'd fought Rhaegar. Barristan having been separated from his king by an endless wall of enemies, unable to reach him no matter how many Barristan slew, and being forced to watch while batting away blades as the King of the Iron Throne was killed. But against Aelor, Baratheon looked wholly mortal, hammer and shield barely able to ward off the prince's sword. The prince, Barristan called, feeling his hopes rise, taking heart in the second son of Aerys. He shouted again, louder this time. "Look to your prince!" Others took the call, a few in the massive number of fleeing men slowing to look. Barristan limped, wound to his thigh throbbing, to the nearest horse. Many knights and animals had died, but there was still an abundance of loose coursers running loose, and pulled himself on top. Kicking the bay's flanks, he galloped to head off the retreating mass of loyalist survivors, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Prince Aelor Targaryen, look to your prince, fight for your prince." More and more took up the call. The emboldened loyalists battling with a new fervor as Aelor and Baratheon savagely dueled over the dead bodies in the ford. Slowly, one or two at a time, men turned direction, stopping the headlong retreat from the battle and beginning to come to the relief of the stalwarts who had never turned tail to run. Barristan rode the unfamiliar stallion side to side, shouting, pointing with his bloody sword, slowly turning the retreat of broken men into a charge of revitalized ones. Some of those fleeing couldn't be stopped, the horrors they had seen driving them from the field like panicked livestock, but more returned to the battle than did not, and Barristan cantered his borrowed courser back towards the ford, accompanied by the shout of thousands of invigorated men rushing to their prince's aid. Aelor was fairly certain they were losing the battle, but he didn't care. He swung his sword again as hard as he could, borrowing a page from Bucket's book and going full offensive. Robert Baratheon, hammer still crimson with his brother's blood, was bigger than Aelor, and in all likelihood stronger, a mountain of muscle that, in his yellow and black livery, reminded the second son of Aerys of a much shorter Gregor Clegane. Aelor was no small man himself, several inches over 6 feet and by all means a strong man in his own right. But Baratheon had a few inches and several pounds of muscle on the Targaryen prince. That didn't make a lick of difference at the moment, however, as the Dragon of Duskendale was fueled by a hatred and battle lust that surpassed anything even Baratheon could feel, sword moving faster than Aelor had ever swung before, snarling viciously with the reverberations of each blow his sword struck on the stag's hammer or shield. Aelor didn't think about Rhaegar dying or dead behind him. He didn't think of anything. The prince's mind was almost blank. Instinct and years of training dictating his every move, adrenaline keeping his legs turning, hatred continuously spitting out curses at the man opposing him. There was a pain in his right hip, one he hadn't noticed until he'd been sprinting towards Baratheon, but the Dragonlord paid it no mind, focused on driving his blade into Robert Baratheon's chest, and watching the life fade from his storm blue eyes. Baratheon regained his center after a few moments, managing to go on his own offensive with a vicious swing of his hammer. As Aelor had noted in the detached part of his mind, Baratheon was strong, amazingly so. To try and block or redirect a blow from that hammer, a feat that would be near impossible for Aelor in his current shieldless state, was a certain way to die, the blunt force of the hammer's broad side or the spiked point of its other able to either penetrate or crush armor, muscle, and bone. Aelor spun away and struck, his sword only catching Baratheon's shield, but his fist colliding with the Lord Paramount of the Stormland's antlered helm. That didn't deter Robert from his newfound aggression, however, another one-handed swing of the mighty hammer nearly crushing every rib Aelor had. The prince dodged away, swinging his bloodied sword hard for Baratheon's head as the hammer's momentum carried the rebel leader off of balance for a moment. Baratheon twisted his head aside, the blow not killing him as intended. It did, however, neatly lop off one of the antlers, sending the shaped steel flying off into the chaos of a battle that had picked up in intensity all around them. With a deep roar, "Theirs is the fury," after all, Robert came on again, using his shield as a battering ram, his hammer as well a hammer, and Aelor was finally forced on the full defensive, dodging both spiked and banded steel. Striking back every so often but mainly reduced to avoiding the whistling death Baratheon had served Rhaegar. His body betrayed him in the end. The pain in his hip had increased throughout the short but savage duel with Robert Baratheon, and when he took a step to the side, setting his feet a touch too wide, a hot, burning shock of pain shot down his leg. Aelor gasped, his knee buckling, leaving him awkwardly splayed on a knee and foot as Baratheon's hammer swung. Aelor tried to bring his sword around out of instinct, even as he twisted his body, the hammer catching his blade just above the pommel and wrenching the ruby crossguard from the dragon of Duskendale's hand. Aelor could only watch as his trusted blade spun end over end into the mayhem surrounding him, his hands now empty. The prince tried to gain his feet, but his awkward stance and the pain in his hip, Bucket's bloody axe, he realized absently, wouldn't let him. He turned his head to look back at Baratheon, the rebel leader standing over him, tossing his shield aside and gripping his hammer two-handed. With a roar, Robert swung, the hammer hurtling towards Aelor's head as if in slow motion. Elia's face came to mind then, as it often did in moments of both weakness and strength. What the Dragon Lord wouldn't give for a chance to make her laugh one last time. Rhaenys and her dolls, most of which Aelor had begged, borrowed, or stole for her, soon followed, the little olive-skinned girl's giggles accompanying the smile of her mother. And then Aegon, too young yet to have done anything to endear Aelor to him, but somehow having managed to do so anyway. A small bundle of blankets and silvery hair that Aelor knew in his heart would make the greatest king Westeros had seen since Jaehaerys the Conciliator. He wanted them to know he loved them, and that he was sorry he hadn't made it back. He wanted to hold them one more time, to tickle Rhaenys and pinch Aegon's nose and kiss the ever-loving fuck out of Elia. All of those thoughts and more ran through his mind in the split second it took that hammer to reach his head, Baratheon's roar ringing in his ears. The strength had to have come from his loved ones because the Seven knew it hadn't come from his body. Aelor ducked, the hammer whistling overhead, his hand darting to wrap his fist around the emerald dagger on his belt. With a roar of his own, the dragon of Duskendale shot up into Baratheon, forcing himself between the stag's arms and inside his guard. The dagger in the dragon's fist flew high above both their heads before plunging deep into the gap between helm and breastplate, sinking to the hilt. For a moment the two warriors stood helm to helm, screaming at each other at the top of their respective lungs, Robert's hammer hanging in the air in his left fist off to the side, his right gauntlet somehow having grabbed Aelor's shoulder. Time stood still as Robert's war cry turned into a gurgle, blood filling his mouth and throat and lungs. The dragon of Duskendale's dagger sank deep into his neck. The hammer in his left hand, still held out as if confused that it hadn't just smashed a Targaryen's brain all over the Riverlands, began to shake before the hand holding it lost its once incredible strength, and it splashed to the water. Aelor Targaryen released the dagger that had struck so true and stepped back, Robert Baratheon sinking to his knees in the mud and blood and water. With a bloody cough, the dying warrior cursed the Targaryen name one last time, before toppling forward to land face first in the Crimson Ford. Eddard knew Robert was dead the moment it happened, even as he blocked the blow from another Dornishman. The cry that burned through both the rebel and loyalist ranks soon after simply confirmed it. Hoster Tully's reserve had taken the brunt of the screaming Dornish charge, most of his men cut to bloody pieces as they bought time for Eddard to turn his Northmen and counter the surprise strike. Just how the Dornish had slipped thousands of men behind them undetected was baffling, but here they were, full of vim and vigor and raising one hell of a ruckus. Eddard slung this particular Dornishman's blade aside before cutting his throat, turning as a voice called his name. "My lord." Another knight, this one a merman of Manderley and possessing both arms, pointed to the main battle of the ford. Valemen and Stormlanders were beginning to flee, their spirit for the fight waning as the life of their leader had, the previously broken loyalist attacking with a new vigor, a new life. A man in Kingsguard white rode a courser in their midst, directing the main force through the gap of the right where Eddard had to pull his men from. They broke through the thin remaining forces quickly, turning and beginning to roll up the center as more and more rebels fled. As Eddard saw it, he had two options: finish the Dornish and turn to take on the weary loyalist, or quit the field. Robert is dead. Our claim is gone. Thousands of men have died for personal disagreement between a few, and now most of those few are dead. The only one remaining is me. It was all a bloody waste, a waste of tears, a waste of blood, and a waste of his life. Eddard decided enough lives had been lost. Great John, the Umber cut his song off mid-sentence, cracking one more skull before turning to his liege. Enough lives have been lost. Sound the retreat. You have the rear guard. Hold the line until most of our force is away, then make a fighting withdrawal. The giant plainly didn't like the whole idea of retreating. We can win this, boy. Too many have died already. Give the command. As the horns blew, Valemen, Riverlanders, Stormlanders, and Northmen all beginning to flee the field, Eddard helped solidify the Great John's line. Keeping the Dornish attack from turning the withdrawal into a rout was easier than expected. As the loyalist men who flanked the main lines made no attempt to pursue, and the Dornish seemed to have had their fill of a fight as well, their attack not nearly as fierce as it had been mere minutes before. As the rebels to the Iron Throne fled past him, leaving thousands of their dead sprawled across the grounds behind them, Ned Stark couldn't help but feel he had failed. Failed his friend. Failed his bannermen and failed his family. "I am sorry, father. I'm sorry, Brandon. I'm sorry, Lyanna, your grace." Aelor Targaryen didn't move. He hadn't since Baratheon fell, not moving an inch as the rebel lines were finally broken. "Your grace." The dragon of Duskendale stood motionless on a slaughter field, staring down at the back of a now dead Robert Baratheon. Blood was dribbling down his armor at his hip. His once pristine black armor now crimson with blood and brown with mud. Barristan reached out a hand gently, wary of a sudden reaction, though just what Aelor would do without any weapon remained to be seen. It turned out he had no need to worry. The second son of Ares didn't move an inch when Barristan the Bold's hand lightly rested on his shoulder, still staring down at the body of the usurper king. Barristan felt a stab of panic. Worry that the boy he thought of as son was more severely injured than the very painful but not life-threatening gash on his hip. The Kingsguard disregarded his own injuries to step to the front of Aelor, looking him over with a quick eye. When the prince spoke, his voice was quiet and hoarse. "I'm fine, Barristan." Relief flooded Barristan the Bold, though it was tainted by the dead tone of the Lord of Duskendale's voice. "Your helm, Aelor." The prince finally looked up. The violet of his eyes barely visible around Aelor's dilated pupils. Barristan understood what was happening at once. He's in shock. "My what?" Barristan took a firmer grip on the prince's arms. "Your helm, your grace." Fingers were suddenly pulling the white flame crest up and over the Dragon Lord's head. Alaric Langward, ever the dutiful squire, stood behind his mentor, his once youthful face now showing no trace of the boy he had been so recently, replaced by the firm eyes and jaw of a man who had seen the worst the world had to offer. "Easy, your grace." Aelor finally twitched, looking as if he was waking from a dream. If he were, reality was surely a shock. The ford was clogged with the dead, the bodies thick enough in places that a man could walk across the River Trident without ever touching the water. Both riverbanks were much the same, though the bank where the rebels had waded was by far the worst. Loyalist men, the victors if a chaotic slaughter like this could have won, Barristan didn't believe it could, were already looting. A flock of bodies scoping the ford near where the king of the Iron Throne lay dead. Those men, mostly peasant farmers who normally barely had enough to eat much less any idea of wealth, were frantically searching the water for the rubies Robert's hammer had smashed from Rhaegar Targaryen's breastplate, paying no attention to the body that had been their king. Nor did they pay attention to the wounded lying all around, their screams and moans a cacophony of terrible sound around a horrible scene. How many men are left? Aelor was looking side to side slowly, though he dutifully stopped and drank when Alaric pressed a water skin to his lips. "We don't know, your grace." "Too few, my son, too bloody few." 3,000 knights had charged down a wide ford with Aelor Targaryen, punching a hole that over 20,000 soldiers had filled. 83 of them lived. Sir Bauman Bayich was found halfway under his horse on the far side of the river, a dirk through the eye of his visor. Lord Elwood Hart, the last of his dynasty, had fallen less than 10 feet from him, a spear in his gut, the young man's hands wrapped around its shaft as he leaned against the belly of a dead courser. Sirs Willis and Alester, two of his most veteran household knights, had died together, Alester's head in a slumping Willis' lap, the latter having bled out from his own wounds while trying to comfort his old friend. In truth, none of Aelor's personal retinue seemed to have lived. Men Aelor had handpicked from all over Westeros dying together for the prince they served. Only that prince had survived. That prince, a squire and a black stallion. Warrior had found his master as Aelor stood supported by Barristan and Aelor in the middle of the ford, clopping over dead bodies carelessly as it emerged from the field of corpses. The destrier was red from muzzle to hock. The twin white warring dragons on the cloth of his chainmail blanket turned crimson. He, much like his master, was battered but still alive, nudging the Targaryen with his head as if to apologize for letting him fall off. Aelor was glad his horse had lived. Very little else had. Rhaegar Targaryen, the first of his name, was being carried from the field by Jon Connington, the Lord of Griffin's Roost, bawling uncontrollably. The red-haired knight had slain Daenerys Arryn, heir to the Vale, in single combat on the far bank. But he looked nothing like an accomplished warrior now, face as red as his flaming hair as tears cut furrows down his grimy cheeks. Aelor watched dry-eyed. He'd recovered his senses, enough to order a maester away to more severely wounded men when he came and asked about his hip, but his body still felt numb. As teams of men combed through the bloody carnage, healers descending to try and save any lives they could after so many had been lost, Aelor only watched. Survivors clinging to each other or themselves as they tried to cope with what had just occurred. Prince Oberyn, a wound over his right eye, had ridden by for once without a word, heading for his tent and his paramour. Randall Tarley had taken temporary command, keeping the survivors from straggling away while also organizing a guard, though the rebels had to be suffering from the same symptoms as the loyalists. Aelor had let him. He hadn't budged from his stance beside the body of Robert Baratheon, and he wouldn't. Not until they found him. When they finally did, Aelor had required Alaric to help him move. His hip a throbbing pain that became shooting when he put nearly any weight on it, but move he had. Lord Renfred Ricker had ended up on the far left of the ford where the water was still relatively deep, back leaning against the rebel riverbank, while his waist and legs were submerged in the deepening water of the River Trident. His once blue surcoat was now blood red. The broken lance in his left shoulder embedded deeply. A sword was shoved in his side, under his ribs, though his hand still clutched his warhammer, refusing to surrender the weapon that adorned his family banner. Aelor knew before he even reached his old friend that there was nothing the Meisters would be able to do. The prince dropped beside his childhood companion's side, the cold water soothing his hip even as the scene before him tore apart his heart, taking the Lord of Hollard Hall's hand in his own. Renfred's full black beard was speckled with blood, twin trickles of it trailing down from the corners of his mouth. His breathing was labored, chest rising and falling heavily, its rattling sound giving away the blood slowly filling his lungs. Aelor shook his head. Damn it, Ren. The big man turned his head to look at his best friend despite the pain doing so obviously caused him. It took him several moments to speak, and when he did his voice was pained. Though stronger than a dying man's had any right to be. Did we win? Yes, friend. We won. Baratheon. Dead. Ricker nodded. Good. Aelor felt the burn of tears in his eyes, though he didn't let them fall. I'm sorry, Ren. Even when dying, Ricker managed to raise an eyebrow and be amusement. For what? This, all of it. The Lord of Hollard Hall shook his head. This isn't your fault, Aelor. All men must die now. It's my turn. Aelor swallowed, fighting to keep his composure. I'll care for Mélissa and the babe. Anything they ever want, they'll have. Ricker's eyes stared into his liege lord's bloody lips, smirking. Only Ren could grin as he dies. Hell, I know that. The smirk became pained, a round of great bloody coughs racking Renfred's body as his eyes shut tightly before opening again once the coughing fit passed. Ricker released Aelor's hand, shakily trying to grab his liege lord's wrist. Aelor obliged him. Renfred Ricker looked into his childhood friend's face one last time. Strong shield. All of Duskendale was lodged in Aelor's throat as he squeezed Renfred's wrist tightly. Stronger sword. He smiled a bloody grin. You're damn right. His body convulsed once, twice, 3 times, and then the life faded from Renfred Ricker's eyes. Aelor Targaryen wept. The rider bearing the flag of truce appeared to Eddard Stark as a gift from the old gods. The rebel forces had left thousands of their numbers dead and wounded on the field. The total count still hadn't been made. No one entirely sure who was dead or missing in the aftermath of the chaos they had all been subjected to. All Eddard knew was that Robert was dead, Jon Arryn was wounded, and Hoster Tully was missing. The Lord Paramount of the Vale and second, and only living, father to Eddard had taken a dagger slash to his calf, struck by a no-name knight whom Arryn thought to be dead. The man most certainly hadn't been, ignoring the fact that his leg was gone and he was bleeding out rapidly to strike from his lying position and sink the dagger into Arryn's leg. The wound was superficial, merely making it hard for Jon to walk. The much more dangerous blow to the Lord Paramount had been the death of his heir Daenerys, the darling of the Vale, struck down by Jon Connington at the ford. Lord Arryn hadn't been able to recover his body, and that fact weighed on Eddard's close friend as heavily as the man's death. Whether Hoster Tully was dead or captured, no one could rightly say. None of his retainers had returned, having taken the brunt of the Dornish charge. None of the survivors could remember him being struck down, yet he hadn't fled the field with the rest of the Riverlanders. It was reasonable to assume he was dead, as much as it pained Eddard. He was somewhat indifferent to his good father as a person, but he would have liked his child to have at least one grandfather. The way things seemed now, after the bloody fight of the ford, he or she may not even have a father. The rider bearing the white banner rode in at dusk, the shouts of his approach echoing through the camp. It was a single man riding a bay courser while leading another workhorse hauling a cart. Eddard and Jon Arryn waited in the center of the camp, Arryn using a broken spear shaft as a makeshift crutch. The great Jon Bronze Yohn Royce and other various nobles and bodyguards with them as the rider was directed to them, watched warily by the weary men in the camp. As he approached, Eddard realized the envoy was a lad no more than 6 and 10. Tall but lanky, he was dressed in a magnificent set of plate armor, scrubbed clean. Recently at that, if Eddard had a guess, for nothing had been clean after the Battle of the Trident, not armor, not weapons, and not the participants' souls. The boy reined up several paces away from the men gathered to meet him, his face trying not to betray the nervousness he had to be feeling when surrounded by men he had been trying to kill, and who had been trying to kill him hours before. "I come with a message from Prince Aelor Targaryen, Lord of Duskendale." Great Jon scoffed, regarding the boy atop the horse with derision. "Targaryen sends a green boy to parley. Does he mean to insult us, sending a whelp in his own place?" The lad wisely didn't rise to the great Jon's ribbing. "I was instructed to speak with Lords Eddard Stark and Jon Arryn." "I am Jon Arryn," the Lord Paramount of the Vale said quietly. He gestured towards Eddard. "This is Lord Stark. Who are you, son? And why did Targaryen send you instead of another?" The boy straightened. "I am Sir Alaric Langward, squire to Prince Aelor during the battle and knighted shortly afterwards." The lad was quiet a moment, his voice soft when he spoke again. "I suppose he sent me because everyone else he trusts is dead, courtesy of your lordships. He is not the only man to have lost friends and family." Lord Jason Mallister of Seaguard said pointedly. The handsome man with the winged helm had lost his brother Thaddeus to King Rhaegar's second wave, having slain 3 minor lords to avenge him. "Sir, or bloody not, you're a boy," the great Jon reiterated, pushing the lad's control. "Targaryen insults us by sending half a man to treat with us." "Peace, great Jon," Bronze Yohn Royce cut in, eyeing the lad. "If he was Targaryen's squire, he is man enough to be here. We knocked the prince off of his stallion during Robert's charge. This whelp, as you call him, fought off some of our best men to give Targaryen time to regain his feet." Langward's chest swelled at that, pride evident on his face though he tried to conceal it. He's more man than boy if Bronze Yohn is correct, but still part boy nonetheless. Eddard cleared his throat, regarding the teenager with an emotionless face as he spoke. "What word does your prince have for us?" Langward's voice took an even tone, obviously repeating words he had rehearsed in his head for hours. "Prince Aelor offers your lordships the opportunity to reclaim your dead. Come morning you may send a burial detail of no more than 150 men to the ford, where you will be left in peace to claim what bodies you wish. Whomever you leave shall be cremated alongside our own dead at dusk tomorrow." The new knight gestured towards the horse and cart slightly behind him. "He sends this as a token of his goodwill." Langward looked directly at Jon, his tone becoming somber. "It is your heir, Lord Arryn." The Lord of the Vale didn't move for a long moment, face completely expressionless, before turning his head in the direction of Bronze Yohn Royce, who instantly exited the half-circle of rebel leaders to quietly step to the cart's side. He looked over the lip of the cart for a moment before turning back to his liege lord, nodding softly. Jon Arryn's jaw worked silently for a moment more before he spoke quietly. A few of his bodyguard joining Royce at the cart to retrieve the body of Daenerys Arryn. "Give him my thanks." Alaric Langward nodded. "Prince Aelor also invites Lords Stark and Arryn to discuss peace terms while the bodies are claimed, on this side of the river though far from the edge of the forest. He agrees to 50 men in your personal guard, though he will bring double that due to the burial party and the location of the meeting. He invites a single representative from the Stormlands in lieu of a Lord Baratheon. Lord Roose Bolton, pale eyes unblinking, stared at the boy. And how do we know it isn't a trap? Sir Aelor turned to meet the Lord of the Dreadfort's odd eyes evenly, the slightest touch of anger in his own. Prince Aelor is a man of his word. A Targaryen being a man of his word, Great John's scorn was met with several murmurs of agreement from the other lords surrounding them. Eddard, however, believed the lad. I have met Prince Aelor on more than one occasion. Whatever his family's faults, he does seem to be a man of honor, and he is consenting to meeting us when we have the advantage, however slight. So he is a fool as well as a madman, boomed fat Lord Benedar Belmore. He is neither, Jon Arryn said quietly but with a hint of steel in his voice that stopped his bannerman's sniggers instantly. Jon Arryn looked back to Sir Aelor. You made no mention of the Riverlands. The young man shrugged. We already have a representative from the Riverlands. Lord Hoster Tully is our prisoner. Brynden Blackfish Tully, so far having remained quiet, instantly spoke up. Is he injured? Eddard found the apparent concern from the Blackfish odd, considering he had never seen the Tully brothers at anything other than each other's throats. We found him unconscious from a fall from his horse but otherwise unharmed. The Blackfish grunted satisfied. Eddard looked to Jon Arryn, who met his eyes and held them for a moment before nodding. The Lord of the North then nodded in turn to Sir Aelor. Tell Prince Aelor we will be there at dawn. If their war had accomplished nothing else, it had at least aged Aelor Targaryen at least a decade. As he rode towards them on a massive black stallion surrounded by 100 men of his choosing, Eddard saw that the dragon of Duskendale looked almost nothing like the young, full of life youth he had been at the tournament of Harrenhal. When the foundations had been laid for the war they were currently fighting. He still carried the air of authority, Ned remembered, his shoulders still strong and broad and back still straight in the saddle, but his face was that of an older man than 21. A mostly healed scar sliced down his right eye, framed by his silvery beard grown bushy and untrimmed. Some scars added to a man's handsomeness. This was not one of those scars, though his face still held traces of its Targaryen beauty. This scar was a vicious gash that drew the attention of all those in contact with the Dragon Prince. It almost made him look more sellsword than Prince, brilliant black armor and destrier aside. Until he spoke, then there was no doubt he was of royal blood. Lord Stark and Arryn, I am glad you came. Let us put an end to this bloodshed. The dragon of Duskendale looked to his right, where Sir Barristan Selmy sat a white courser beside Hoster Tully, the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands tied to his saddle like a common bandit. The prince nodded, and Selmy withdrew a dagger to cut Tully's hands free. A thin Dornishman atop a sand steed to Tully's other side. Undoubtedly Prince Oberyn Martell slapped the Lord's courser lightly on the flank, prompting the horse to trot the few dozen paces between the two sides to pull up beside the Blackfish. The two brothers looked at one another only a moment before both turning to look back at the loyalist. Prince Aelor, Jon Arryn began, I want to thank you for returning Denai's body to me. Enemy or no, the man fought bravely, he deserved to rest with his own. And Robert? Ned asked quietly. Aelor Targaryen met his eyes, violet on gray. His body resides in my camp. Roose Bolton cocked an eyebrow. Are we not allowed to claim his body as well? Targaryen cocked his own brow. Are you a Baratheon? No, then you don't have a claim, do you? The prince let his words hang a moment before continuing. He hasn't been mutilated, nor will he be. I will consent to his body being entombed at Storm's End. Despite my personal desire to remove his head and place it on a spike on Meager's holdfast. The prince's eyes confirmed he meant what he said, though he leaned back slightly in his saddle to regard the others. That is assuming we can put an end to this nonsense here and now, of course. Arryn nodded ever so slightly. What are you thinking? Surrender, the dragon of Duskendale said instantly and firmly. Yours here and now. This war was started over the personal disagreements between a few men. Most of those men are now dead. Thousands have already died. I see no need for thousands more to join them. Tully grunted. There will be repercussions. Of course there will, for all of you, though some of you will fare worse than others. They waited for a moment for the prince to continue, but the dragon of Duskendale simply met their gazes evenly. Jon Arryn broke the silence. What do you mean? Aelor spoke calmly and confidently. You, Lord Arryn, didn't surrender your wards when your liege lord ordered it. That liege lord killed my father and brother, as well as one of Jon's kinsmen. Ned pointed out, he meant to do the same with us. Yes, he did, Aelor said with a nod. You didn't let me finish, Lord Stark. My father was an unfit king, though still my father. My brother also made more than his share of mistakes and the realm has bled for it. I'm not saying you were not justified in revolting, my lords, but the truth remains that you did revolt. You revolted against a dynasty that has ruled for close to 300 years. And you lost, Great John scoffed. We haven't lost yet. There's still an army behind us. Aelor shrugged at the big umber. You're right, there is one likely equal to my own, but how long will it remain there? Aelor leaned back in his saddle, perfectly aware that he was in control of these negotiations. Your claimant through Rael Targaryen is dead, and with him died your only chance to pass this off as a war of succession instead of conquest. Robert's brothers are both being besieged by Lord Mace Tyrell and the Red Wine Fleet. While I hear they are holding out impressively, it can only go on so long. If you were to decide to continuously rebel, you would have to fight through me and my army to even have a chance to reach them. Something we all know would take months to do if you could even succeed. By then Stannis and Renly would either be in Lord Tyrell's custody or dead of starvation. Either way their own claims would be gone. So tell me, with no Baratheon, who among you would be crowned king? Aelor turned to look at Lord Tully. You, Lord Tully, your ancestors were petty kings only raised to their position of power by Aegon the Conqueror. Why should the other great houses follow you? He turned to Jon Arryn. You, Lord Arryn, your ancestors arrived as Andal invaders and have ruled the Vale for generations, but you were only ever kings of one kingdom, not 7. Finally the Dragon of Duskendale turned to Ned. And you, Lord Stark, you have ruled the North for 6,000 years or longer. But you don't even follow the same gods as the rest of the realm. How long would the High Septon and Zealots allows you to rule them? The prince began alternating his gaze among all of the men present. Sure, were you to successfully eliminate my bloodline, your cooperation and friendship with one another may well let one of you rule. But what about your sons? What about your sons' sons? How many generations before one of them realize that their king has no right to be their king and starts another war that ends more lives? How long would they in turn rule before another decides it should be him? Tell me, my lords, where would that cycle of death and blood end? What right do Targaryens have to rule us all? Shot back Bronze Yohn Royce. The right we took and held for 300 years. Targaryens united the realms, placing them under one banner. While we haven't always ruled well, we have withstood threats from our own kinsmen and from countless other threats, and we have done it for 300 years. That is a precedent that holds sway among many, my lords, even you cannot deny that. A precedent set by dragons. Hoster Tully pointed out, and all the dragons are dead, boy. No, Tully, Aelor Targaryen said, eyes burning with a fire that Eddard had only ever seen in the blood of old Valyria. The dragons are most certainly not. There was silence for a long moment before Selwyn Tarth, the representative of the Stormlands, spoke up. Say we wanted the kingdoms to separate again, each ruling under the family that ruled them 300 years ago. There has been a king of the Iron Throne, proof that one man can rule all 7 kingdoms. Again I ask, how long before one of your descendants decides that should be him, and starts more bloody battles that throw the entire continent into a chaos that would be ripe for the raiding by the Ironborn, who would once again rape and pillage unchecked with no one to temper their lusts? Tell me, where would those battles end? Aelor Targaryen shook his head. No, my lords, the only hope for your families, not only now but in the future, is to end this conflict today. Bend your knees now. And I promise I will take into consideration your reasons for rebelling. The dragon of Duskendale's violet eyes began to burn again, his scarred but regal face growing dark. If you decide to continue this war, however, when I defeat you, and I will defeat you, there will be no such consideration. I will reclaim what you tried to take from my family with fire and blood, the blood of you and your kin down to the very last drop. A quiet hung over the field then, only interrupted by the sounds of the burial party recovering dead rebel nobles all around them. The rebel leaders glanced among one another as Aelor Targaryen and his men looked on in silence, the tension in the air clear. Eddard moved first, taking the same motions his ancestor Torrhen Stark had 3 centuries ago. Ned slid off of his garron smoothly, scared as any man would be but inwardly confident that this was the right course of action for his family and his people. Aerys, the man who killed my father and brother, is dead. Rhaegar, the man who kidnapped my sister, is dead. Aelor, my only chance at seeing my sister again, is offering terms we won't see again if we continue to fight and lose. Whatever happens to me, this is best for my people, for my sister, for my child. Eddard Stark, Lord Paramount of the North, walked smoothly to stand a few paces in front of Aelor Targaryen's black destrier, meeting the prince's eyes for only a moment before dropping to his knee, head bowed. He heard others follow his lead. A great hulking presence appearing at his right that could only be the Great John. a muffled curse accompanying the action that Eddard was sure the big Umber didn't like but was following his liege lord in. A few moments later another sank to his knee to Eddard's left, the grunt of pain accompanying it confirming him as Jon Arryn, Lord Paramount of the Vale. Before long each rebel saddle was empty, the space between the two sides filled with kneeling men. Sitting above them all Aelor Targaryen watched, face impassive but heart for the first time in months at peace. The king was dead. Elia Mardell read and reread the first line of Aelor's message over and over, her stomach hollow. Rumors had of course been filtering into King's Landing for several days, but the parchment in her hand confirmed their authenticity. Rhaegar Targaryen, the first of his name and her husband, had been slain in a shallow ford of the Trident by Robert Baratheon, who had soon after followed his hated enemy into death at the hands of the Dragon of Duskendale. He's dead. After everything, he goes and gets himself killed. My husband is dead. Elia blinked slowly several times, unable to get past the first line of Aelor's letter. She was certain there was important information contained in the following lines. Was the war still going? Had her brother survived? What of Sir Barristan? Those questions and their potential answers took a backseat to the overwhelming fact that her husband, adulterer he may be, was dead, and the ramifications that fact brought with it. My son is the king of the Iron Throne. The mere thought terrified her. She had always known Aegon would one day be lord of the Seven Kingdoms, but she had anticipated the crown passing to him when he was a man, not a child. She'd anticipated Aegon having children of his own to succeed him, and a lifetime of grooming for the role as king. She'd anticipated him being ready. But no. Aegon was a baby, woefully unprepared for anything other than his next meal and nap, yet now he was suddenly saddled with the pressure of containing a massive realm at war with itself. Well, she supposed he wasn't truly saddled with that responsibility, at least not yet. It would fall to Aelor and to Elia herself. Fear ate at her as the thought of her son being a king continued to settle. Child kings normally didn't fare well, and while Elia knew in her heart Aelor cared too much for his nephew to attempt anything untoward, her mind also knew that it was likely many lords would call for Aegon to be usurped by his uncle. Would someone attempt to push that agenda along by removing the infant king through less than legal methods? Did this mean Rhaenys was heir to the throne, or was that now Aelor? Elia didn't know. It was all too much, this sudden change of events. What she wouldn't give for it to be a year ago when events such as these seemed impossible. It took her a long period of time to be able to read past that first damning line that brought so many emotions booming in all at once. She felt she should cry, yet she did not. That she had to go blank for a moment, reading Aelor's words as if his opening statement wasn't there. It didn't work, of course. There was no getting around the death of a king, much less when that king had been your husband and father to your children. She did finally manage to finish Aelor's short, concise letter. A very to-the-point update on events. Rhaegar and Robert were dead. Renfred too, the great big man that had been Aelor's constant companion since they were toddling children. She felt a deep sadness at that. The man's widow Mélissa was due any day now, a pretty if plump woman whom Elia had found to be almost unbearably sweet. Her father Lord Buckwell had been in charge of King's Landing when the Princess of Dorne arrived. A competent if not quite gifted regent. He had acquiesced to her taking over almost as soon as she docked, and had been doing his utmost to be of help since. Now his daughter was a widow though not yet 19, pregnant with the child of a man it would never meet, a situation similar but so much worse than Elia's own. The Queen of the Iron Throne, or was it now Dowager Queen though she was only 26, had always heard war was terrible, but now she saw just why. Many others had died too, it seemed. Her brother was alive and well. Something Elia thanked the Seven for, but 2 of the 3 Baich brothers were now dead, as well as every knight in Aelor's personal retinue. Various other lords she had once known personally had lost their lives as well, corpses over the quarrel of a few men. If she hadn't been ready for Rhaegar's death, she certainly hadn't been ready for news that the other rebellious lords had surrendered. A relief, as palpable as her fear for Aegon, flooded her body at the news that this stupid war that she had helped start was now apparently over. Is this all it took, the death of a few important men to end it? Why did so many thousand innocent ones have to die as well if their death is all it took? Regrets, hopes and fears dominated the Dornishwoman's thoughts for hours as she sat in her solar, dawn turning to afternoon. Elia shooing away Ashara when she entered to check on her. She said nothing to her close companion, but her presence alerted her to the fact that this news must be spread. Aegon was now a king, ready or not, and Rhaegar had meant much on a personal level to more than just Elia. Arthur Dayne happened to be on duty outside her chambers, a convenient if unwanted truth that gave her no time to think of how to handle it. Arthur had been Rhaegar's best friend and closest confidant, and vice versa. So when she blurted out word of the king's death, knowing not in her own personal turmoil how to soften the blow, the handsome knight of the Kingsguard turning as pale as his armor. Dead. Arthur, normally the essence of composure and chivalric grace, stumbled back against the wall, unable to stand straight under the weight of the news. How? Baratheon killed him. Aelor in turn killed Baratheon. Elia, feeling as untethered and hollow as the sword of the morning looked, could only watch as the knight buckled slightly, unable to root herself from her spot to grab him. The king is dead, Arthur. My husband is dead. Elia finally managed to break herself from her turmoil-induced paralysis, stepping up to place her hands on Arthur's shoulders. Aegon is your king now, Arthur. You owe it to Rhaegar to protect him every bit as well as you would have his father. The Sword of the Morning nodded shakily, battling to find his inner equilibrium. Go to your king now. His protection is paramount. Arthur stood to his feet, breathing slowing, recapturing his balance and calm disposition. Rhaegar instructed me to watch you particularly, Elia. I'm instructing you to watch his son. Go, Arthur. It took a good amount more of haggling, the familiar bickering giving them both a bit of a tether in the pit of turmoil that was about to engulf the city. Arthur did eventually go, and Elia found herself wandering, thinking over all that had happened and all that might. The war ending was a great thing, she knew, but it was only one of the problems that faced her son. With the Lord's call for another great council trying to replace an infant with a proven warrior, where was Lyanna Stark? It was all too much, which is probably why she didn't see the men in time. They were dressed in the livery of the guards of the Red Keep. 5 burly men climbing the stairs from the lower levels to enter the empty gallery Elia found herself wandering in. While that in and of itself wasn't unusual, the man who followed them closely certainly was. He was filthy and haggard, once shaved head now covered in gold and white hair that gave proof to his balding state, but there was no mistaking Tywin Lannister. The white armored being behind him, equally as filthy but with a much fuller head of hair framing a stupidly attractive face, was also easily recognizable. This was all odd. Jaime Lannister was supposed to be in the Westerlands, recovering at his home of Casterly Rock from injuries sustained, while trying to defend the Mad King from the freakish assassin and his pig-like partner who had infiltrated the Red Keep during the attempted sack of King's Landing. Yet there the young man stood, unkempt but standing tall, no sign of an injury anywhere in his stance. And his father? Well, Tywin Lannister was supposed to be in the Black Cells, rotting for the attempted murder of her children. And her. Elia's mind connected the dots too late. A big hand grabbed her shoulder, whirling her around. The dagger didn't feel sharp as it plunged into her stomach behind the force of another apparent guardsman. No, it felt more like she'd been punched, the blade plunging deep and driving her breath from her lungs. The reeking, clearly not an actual guard who wielded it, withdrew the blade and drove it again, once, twice more, Elia only able to stare at her killer as her body weakened, finding herself dropping to her knees before falling on her side, curling up as pain started racking her body. Just when Tywin Lannister approached to stand over her, she wasn't sure, her vision going hazy. Her hearing, however, remained clear. Kill the boy and his sister. My lord, we need to get you out of here. They will not be ready for an internal threat. The dragon thought it had the lion defeated. It is time to prove otherwise. Kill the infant. Father, now. As Tywin Lannister sneered down at her one last time, Elia started to laugh, a choked, awful sound. She was dying, she knew, but laughing seemed like such a good idea. In Lannister's need for revenge, he was sending his men to their death. Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, was guarding that boy Tywin was planning to kill. Manfred Dark, the squat, fierce knight with the strength and toughness of a boar, was with Rhaenys, and he would protect her to the very end. Those men were going to die. And Tywin Lannister was going to follow. Even if he managed to escape the city, Aelor would track the old lion down if it took the remainder of his life. Elia knew she wouldn't see her son grow into the great king he would be. She wouldn't see her daughter marry, her grandchildren grow, or be able to finally kiss the face of her dead husband's brother, something she never realized she wanted so much until that moment. She was going to die here on a stone floor, killed by a man with the pride of 1,000 kings, and it was okay. Her children would live, there would be killers chopped down by 2 of the greatest knights she'd ever met. She knew it in her heart, just as she knew she was going to die. Her son would be king, guided by his uncle who loved him. Her daughter would be a princess, with more dolls than dresses thanks to that very same man. Elia realized something in her last moments that she had never understood. No matter the world's troubles, no matter its constant state of terror and turmoil, it would all in the end be all right. Something soothed her as the darkness closed in, a wave of peace and tranquility she hadn't felt since before the tourney of Harrenhal. Elia Mardell, so haunted and hurt in life, was finally at peace. I believe a little catching up is needed to clarify a few things, just so we are all aware of what's going on. This chapter was going to contain a lot more material from the story itself, But since this author's note is rather long, I kept the story material rather short, though it contains answers to many of your questions. In any case, here are a few facts of my story that you might have missed while reading. Jaime Lannister did kill King Aerys. In canon it was after Rhaegar's death, but in this story it was clearly before. As such, Jaime told Rhaegar and Aelor just why he did what he did. Pyromancers, wildfire, let them burn, you'll know. Rhaegar sent him to the Black Cells, as he did kill the king he was sworn to protect, but Rhaegar and Aelor fabricated a story that Jaime had been injured defending Aerys, and that he was recuperating in the Westerlands while they decided what to ultimately do. While he couldn't keep his cloak for killing the king, he also saved King's Landing from that king. And the Targaryen brothers realized that. As such, he was in the cells with his father when the breakout occurred. As for Tywin, he doesn't know Rhaegar is dead and that the war is over. The man was in the Black Cells. Nobody knows those facts besides the men who fought the battle miles away. I mentioned in the story that rumors had been floating through the city, but it's a damn war in medieval times. There would always be rumors, most of which would by nature be false. Elia and Arthur Dayne are the only two people in the city to know absolutely that Rhaegar is dead, as she received a messenger as regent of the city with those facts mere hours before she was killed. Aelor does know Elia and the children are in King's Landing and not Dragonstone, Rhaegar telling him such. I didn't write that into the story, Aelor believing at first that they would remain on Dragonstone. But it is implied that Rhaegar told him so in the time between leaving King's Landing and his death. I obviously didn't write every single interaction between the two, as that would take up time and give limited, if any, value to the story. Finally, I have a favor to ask you, one prompted by an unnamed guest's review, though I assure them whoever they are that I understand their concerns and thank them for taking the time to write them. I don't write angst or drama into my story for the sake of angst and drama. Everything that happens, especially something as big as the death of a POV character, happens for a reason. You don't know the reason because I'm the one writing this story, and sometimes even I don't know what exactly is going to happen next, but it will have effect on future events. Elia died because that is going to have a lasting impact on the story in the future, not because it is fanfiction canon or some other ridiculous notion. I have a plan. Maybe it's an awful one, but it's mine. As is this story. That isn't to discourage guesses as to what might happen or to discourage you all telling me what you want. I love reading your reviews and your thoughts, even the ones written out of sheer hate. Those in particular make me laugh. If you hate the story, go ahead and spew that hate. It won't bother me. If you love it, share the love. It makes me happy. If you have constructive criticism, criticize away. That makes me a better writer. But for goodness sake, don't call an event stupid or ridiculous when you don't know why it's in the story yet. If by the end of this fic you still think it dumb, by all means say so. But until then, for goodness sake, try to bloody trust me. Hopefully this catches everyone up and you'll forgive the rant. Because this /and is so long, I will be thanking all of the recent reviewers next chapter, so don't think I have forgotten about you all. Each of you rock and have my heartfelt thanks. Even those of you who make me shake my head in confusion. As always, I hope you enjoy this somewhat short but important update. And bloody well review. Kerjack, true to his word, Aelor Targaryen has taken into consideration the reasoning behind the rebellion. The prince and a few of his handpicked men had proposed and bickered for hours, while the rebellion leaders waited out of earshot. A pair of pavilions and tables had been dragged across the ford, being slowly cleared of bodies for the key players on both sides to sit, still firmly in neutral ground. There was no guard on them, nor had their weapons been taken, leaving the prince's implications clear. If a Lord Paramount had a change of heart, he could leave and continue the war, though the Dragon of Duskendale had made it perfectly clear that his first offer of terms would be his most lenient. For Eddard Stark, they had been lenient indeed. When the rebellious lords had been summoned, they entered the prince's pavilion to find Aelor seated at the head of the table, Barristan Selmy slightly behind his chair on one side and Alaric Langward on the other. 5 other men sat the table as well, though 3 chairs were left open for the 3 Lord Paramounts. Men Eddard learned were Randall Tarley of Hornhill, John Kennington of Griffin's Roost, Clayton Byitch of Byitch Hall, Oberyn Mardell of Dorne, and Kevan Lannister of the Westerlands. All of the men in the tent watched as the lords took their seats, Aelor speaking directly to Eddard once all of the men had done so. Lord Stark, your reason to rebel was stronger than anyone else here. We have not forgotten that. Aelor stared at him for a long moment, eyes thoughtful. Your wife is with child, yes. Fear for that child plunged like a dagger into Eddard's heart. Though he managed to keep his face impassive and firm, yes, your grace, she will be due soon. Aelor nodded. When the child is 5 name days old, he or she will come to King's Landing as a ward of the crown. serving as a companion to King Aegon if it is a boy or Princess Rhaenys if it is a girl. From that age on they will alternate yearly between King's Landing and Winterfell, living 1 year in the Red Keep before returning north for a year to learn the customs of its people. This will continue until he or she is 6 and 10, when the crown will choose a suitable marriage. Eddard waited for more, but none came. Is that all, your grace? Aelor shrugged. As I said, your reasons for rebelling were the strongest of them all. Half of the Starks were wiped out by my family, and you would have lost your head as well if you hadn't called your banners. As it is, we will require 10 hostages from the north, children of your high lords between the ages of 8 and 6 and 10 and of different houses, to serve as pages or squires for 5 years to ensure your bannermen do not revolt against either the crown or you. Targaryen gave Eddard no time to comment, turning his attentions to Hoster Tully. This will serve a dual purpose with you, Lord Tully, as the child will be your first grandchild. Your involvement in the war was driven strictly by ambition, not slights and offenses against your family. I offered you a royal marriage to either of your daughters, and you bypassed it for a chance to marry them both into 2 other regions. You saw an opportunity to increase your family's standing, and your ambition drove you to try and take it. You failed. Eddard's good father remained calm, meeting the prince's eyes. Aelor held them, own eyes burning, as he continued. Your son Edmure will be sent to King's Landing as soon as you return to Riverrun, to serve as my squire until I deem him fit to knight. Your bannermen will also offer 10 hostages of the appropriate ages, all of different houses, to serve where the crown sees fit to place them. A marriage will be decided by the crown for Edmure as well. Your daughters will remain untouched with their husbands. Though it was argued that an annulment between Lord Jon and Lysa may have been warranted, but the vassalage of Harrenhal and its own subsequent vassals is hereby retracted. Lord Walter went now a direct vassal of King Aegon VI. Tully took it all calmly, nodding when Aelor was finished. I accept these terms. I imagined you would. Aelor turned to face the final Lord Paramount Jon Arryn. Your role in the rebellion was also somewhat understandable. Though not as much as Stark's, your lords will also provide hostages, and any child of your union with Lysa will have the same situation as Lord Stark's own firstborn. The Vale will forfeit a quarter of its foreign trade revenue over the next 5 years to the crown for war reparations. Arryn slowly nodded. The second son of Aerys sat back in his chair, eyeing them all. I find these terms to be more than generous, but I believe they are just since you willingly bent the knee when you could have prolonged this war for months. You have my word, for what it's worth to you, that the hostages will be treated well and cared for as is befitting of their stations, serving as squires or ladies-in-waiting and educated by the best tutors in King's Landing. You rebelled against the crown, something that won't be forgotten, but my family forced your hand, and that cannot be forgotten either. If one or more of you find these terms unacceptable, you will be free to return unharmed to your men and continue this war, though I believe you know the punishments I will dole out if you do. If you all however agree, I as Hand of the King welcome you back into the King's peace. Each man looked at one another, Eddard meeting his good father's eyes and tilting his head in question, as Tully would be the most weakened afterwards. The Lord of Riverrun inclined his head, and Eddard turned back to the Targaryen prince. We accept. Aelor nodded. Excellent, my lords, let us put this conflict behind us. A question, your grace, Jon Arryn said. What of Stannis and Renly? The dragon of Duskendale glanced to the table for a moment before looking up. They followed their brother's lead, as is expected of younger siblings. I cannot fault them for that. There will be reparations for the Stormlands, of course, including hostages. I intend Renly to foster either with me or a loyalist house, but I am not cruel. Robert is dead, as is my brother. The younger Baratheons will not be unjustly punished for the elder's actions. He looked to Sir Kevan as well, the Lannister knight watching the proceedings quietly. The Westerlands will be reprimanded as well, Lord Tywin in particular. But Sir Kevan and his men served us faithfully on the Trident. Details will be worked out once peace is assured. I know my father has damaged the Targaryen name, as did my brother, but I intend to repair those damages promptly. The Prince of the Iron Throne stood, Eddard noting as he himself and the others lords gained their feet that Aelor had to brace himself on his chair to do so. He was injured as well, it seems. Go to your men, my lords. Stand them down. Speak with them on these matters. I will send a retinue of men led by Lord Tarly to gather the names of those hostages you decide upon, and will visit your camp at nightfall to straighten out any details left lingering. Thank you, my lords, for seeing sense. The men nodded, turning to shuffle out of the tent. Lord Eddard, remain a moment, the prince called softly. Jon Arryn met his eyes before nodding and leaving the tent, cane in hand. Oberyn, Barristan and Alaric remain as well. The rest of you leave us. Lord Tarly, prepare your men and escort the lords back to their camp. Once the tent had emptied, Prince Aelor limped to stand in front of Eddard. I know the question burning in your mind, Ned. He turned to the map across the table, lightly placing a finger in northern Dorne. And I have your answer. I do know where Lyanna is. The soar of hope in Eddard's chest was dulled by the look on the Targaryen's face as he turned to face him again. His tone was somber as he spoke, violet eyes dull. But there is something you must know first. By the third man, Sir Manfred Dark of the Kingsguard was fairly certain he had gathered all the information he was going to, but he interrogated and killed the rest of them anyway. 5 men had been captured in the murder of Elia Mardell and the attempted murders of Aegon and Rhaenys Targaryen. 5 of them had been wounded by Sir Manfred and Sir Arthur Dayne, yielding once they'd been bled. And the 6th had surrendered when he realized he was suddenly all alone with 2 infuriated knights of the Kingsguard. It was determined that 10 men had infiltrated the Red Keep dressed as Targaryen guardsmen, stealing their way to the Black Cells to free Lord Tywin Lannister and his son Jaime. 8 had been sent to kill the new king of the Iron Throne and his sister, the last 2 proceeding on with the Lannister patriarch and his apparently very much whole son. Those 8 had been expecting 1 Kingsguard knight, and with 8-to-1 odds they had an advantage over even a white cloak. What they'd gotten, however, was 2 Kingsguard knights, and if it weren't for Manfred and Dayne both deciding they needed as many alive as possible, the murderers would have to a man died outside the nursery. The fight had been brutal, quick, and entirely one-sided, but by the time the 8 had been subdued and Elia Mardell's body found, the remaining Westlanders were gone. Dayne had been inconsolable, while Manfred didn't care for the pompous, flowery cunt. He wished the man had been brought low by something other than the death of sweet Elia. He'd bloody liked the Dornishwoman, and Manfred as a rule hated everyone. When he'd found her body curled in on itself in one of the first-level galleries, her thin form in a pool of her own blood, he'd never felt such failure or pain in his life. He could only imagine what the prince would do when he arrived. Lord Buckwell had taken over regent duties again, seamlessly to the citizens of King's Landing. They'd kept both the death of the king and queen quiet so far, though rumors of the former's death had been circulating for days. Manfred had led a detail of guards after the Lannisters, but the 2 men had disappeared without a trace. He'd scoured the countryside for miles around, Varys and his little birds, or whatever the hell they were called, searching just as ardently. But all he had gotten out of it was an even worse disposition than normal when he finally returned to King's Landing. Arthur Dayne hadn't gotten anywhere with the prisoners, but even when interrogating a murderer, the knight was held back by notions of honor and kindness. Manfred had no such inhibitions, and combined with his foul mood, he had gotten answers quickly. Those answers had led him here to the Maester's tower. Manfred didn't give enough fucks to keep this quiet. He flung the door open, storming into Grand Maester Pycelle's chambers, Donald Buckwell and his mustache close behind him. The king and princess were with Renfred Riker's new widow and Ashara Dayne, locked in her chambers surrounded by 10 guardsmen Manfred knew were loyal. Trusted was too strong a word, because fuck everyone and Arthur Dayne all on high alert. 5 other guardsmen spread out, Manfred caring not a whit for what he smashed as he bowled through the Maester's chambers, throwing open additional doors and pulling up his mattress, searching everywhere for the aging man. With a bellowed curse, he threw the mattress aside. Find him now." A crash sounded overhead and Lord Buckwell instantly started moving. The rookery Manfred, the knight of the Kingsguard, was short with short legs, but he overtook the taller, middle-aged regent before the Lord of Antlers could even reach the stairs. More sounds came from upstairs as he ascended 2 steps at a time, the squawk of ravens that Manfred found so bloody annoying, accompanied by another crash. When the knight of the Kingsguard came to the rookery door, he found it unsurprisingly barred from the inside, meant to buy Pycelle more time. In most cases it probably would, but Manfred was too pissed to let a measly barred door stop him. He lowered his boulder-like shoulder and charged, splintering the wood as he burst into the rookery room, door hinges squeaking and ravens squawking. Pycelle, dressed in the robe and chain of the citadel, gray beard long and actions panicked, shuffled towards the release window of the rookery, a large raven on his arm, its legs strapped with a rolled parchment. Sir Manfred Dark let out a roar as he charged forward, drawing his sword from its sheath as the Maester reached the window, Pycelle letting a panicked shout escape his lips. The treacherous teacher stuck his arm out of the opening, the great black bird perched there opening its wings to take flight. Manfred Dark had never hit truer in his extensive life of swordplay. His blade darted out of the window, his massive form shoving Pycelle's infirm one out of the way, bringing his blade down as hard as his bulging arm could. His blade cleaved completely through the raven's left wing and part of its head, killing the bird instantly, sending its carcass and whatever message it bore spiraling down towards the courtyard. Manfred didn't watch its body long, propelling his sword arm backwards to smash an elbow into the Grandmeister of the Citadel's nose, Pycelle shouting out in pain as bone and cartilage was crushed, the blow knocking him backwards to the ground. With a curse of rage, the Knight of the Kingsguard hurled his sword aside, intending to break this traitor one bone at a time. Pycelle tried to scoot backwards, moving much quicker than the Meister normally did, one hand on his ruined nose. Manfred grabbed him by his robe, pulling the whimpering old man up with one arm as the big knight drew his right fist back. "Manfred, stop!" Buckwell shouted as he ran into the room, chest heaving, causing the ugly knight to hesitate. While he by no means liked Buckwell, Manfred didn't quite hate him either. And the dealings they had had in years past as Aelor's bannerman and sworn sword respectively had fostered some level of respect in the knight for the competent, calm lord of the antlers. "Why the fuck should I?" Manfred shot back, barely able to keep from tearing the whimpering, pathetic traitor in his grasp into multiple chunks of dead turncoat. "Because we need to know what else he has done, and even you can't get answers from a dead man," Buckwell reasoned, ignoring Pycelle as he tried to caution Manfred. "I'll just break a few bones." "He's older than even me, Manfred. The shock that comes with broken bones might kill him." Donald Buckwell maintained eye contact. "Prince Aelor is mere days away from the city. He'll want more than a few words with this piece of shit as well, wouldn't you say?" Manfred cursed inwardly as Buckwell played the only card he knew for certain would work. It still took everything the newest knight of the Kingsguard had to stop from breaking the Grandmeister's bones one by one. But Manfred finally dropped the whimpering man to the ground. "We'll take him to a cell, somewhere nice enough to keep the fucker alive." Guardsmen filtered around Lord Buckwell to do as they were ordered, lifting the crying traitor up by his arms. Manfred glared at him as they started to drag him away, following closely behind. "And someone get that damn raven's body. We need to see what else this piece of shit has done beside help kill the queen." King's Landing had both changed and stayed the same. The streets of King's Landing had slowly regained their bustle, the terrors of the attempted pillage still evident in places but slowly being forgotten. That bustle slowly died again, however, when the royal party started down the street, Aelor at its head, the wagon and its boxed burden behind him. The bells of the Sept of Baelor began to ring, confirming to the citizens crowding the entire street what they'd been hearing as rumor. The king was dead. Long live the king. Aelor's army was setting up camp outside the city's gates, Randyll Tarly in command, the rebel forces under strict orders from the three Lord Paramounts to follow Tarly's commands as ardently as they would their own. Stark, Arryn and Tully were farther back in line, bringing up the end of the somber procession as they went forward to swear fealty to King Aegon VI. Rhaegar, dead now for days, had been cremated at the Trident, as was Targaryen tradition. His armor, sword and shield, however, were displayed on the wagon, along with the crown his brother had seldom worn in his short reign. The normally loud streets were quiet, all eyes on the empty suit of armor or the prince riding in front of it, scarred face solemn and just a touch impatient. Aelor was ready to see Alyr again. He was ready to hold Aegon and tickle Rhaenys. The seven did he want to just gallop on ahead. But tradition demanded he escort his brother's remains to the great Sept of Baelor. He knew that was dreadful of him, to so desperately want to strike this last duty he could perform for his brother, but Rhaegar was dead. Whatever their differences, that still pained Aelor greatly, but he didn't see how escorting an empty suit of crushed armor would make any buggering difference. Yet escort he did, Barristan, Oberyn and Alaric all riding abreast directly behind the wagon. The streets cleared before him, Warrior's massive form appearing as a stone splitting the current. Aelor's hip throbbed, the injury already beginning to heal but still buggering annoying, but even that discomfort was nothing when he thought of holding Alia. Aelor knew there would be quite a bit of political fallout over any relationship the two might form, especially if it were to form too soon after Rhaegar's death, but the second son of Aerys couldn't find it in himself to care in the slightest. He'd killed dozens of men, lost dozens of friends and lost two brothers, one of blood and one of choice, to keep Alia and the children safe. The seven themselves couldn't stop him now. Only it seemed they could. As soon as Rhaegar's armor was to the Sept, Aelor had kicked Warrior into a canter, the citizens of King's Landing diving out of the way of the thundering warhorse and his rider. Thoughts of Alia filled his head as he nigh on flew towards the Red Keep, the capitulated lords forgotten. The pain from Bucket's Theo Wull of the northern clans Aelor had learned, axe completely forgotten. The gates to the Red Keep were barely opened in time for the Targaryen prince to gallop through it, the second gate at the end of the drawbridge of Meager's holdfast the same. Aelor had reined up, jumping off of Warrior's back with barely contained excitement from the prospect of seeing Aelia and the children after more than half a year of war. When he saw Sir Manfred Dark and Donald Buckwell approaching from the holdfast, their faces somber. "Manfred," the prince called cheerily. "It's been a long time." "Yes, your grace," the ugly man replied, eyes downcast. That struck Aelor as odd because Manfred never looked downcast. Barely contained rage was much more his style. "Bloody hell, Manfred, what's wrong? The war is over, friend, and that white cloak suits you." "The war is not over, your grace," Lord Buckwell said, his eyes also on the ground. "I fear it has only begun." A feeling of dread chased the excitement he had felt mere seconds ago away. His smile disappeared, replaced by a concerned frown even as Oberyn, Barristan and Alaric galloped into the courtyard. "What has happened?" Aelor demanded over the clop of hooves. "Tywin Lannister and his son have escaped, your grace," Manfred said. "Fucking Meister Pycelle smuggled in men dressed as our own buggering guardsmen. He then sent ravens to all of Lannister's bannermen remaining in the Westerlands, ordering them to rally at Casterly Rock." Buckwell cut in. "It only stands to reason he intends to fight, especially considering he doesn't know the other rebellious lords laid down their arms." Aelor's face hardened. "He will still fight even after he finds out." Aelor cursed. "We should have killed him before we left King's Landing." Aelor shook his head, anger at the audacity of the lion and the treachery of the Meister burning in his stomach, but a wave of relief was on its fringes. He had been expecting much worse from the appearance of his two loyal men. "This is a setback, but it is not the end of the world, friends. Lannister cannot possibly hold out against us, no matter his numbers." "There is more," Aelor, Buckwell said. He opened his mouth to speak, but words seemed to catch in his throat. Manfred delivered the news, as blunt in speech as he was in all other aspects. "Aelia is dead. Lannister had her killed as he fled and tried to have the children killed as well." Everything went cold all at once. Aelor Targaryen heard the choked cry from behind him, knowing in some recess of his mind that it was Oberyn, but Manfred's statement was all he could think of, the words visualized in his mind's eye, staring at them for ages. "Aelia is dead." Manfred's stony voice rang in his ears, delivering the message again and again. "Aelia is dead." The entire reason he was still alive, the very thing that had given him the strength to defeat Robert Baratheon, had been ripped from his clutches at the very last. Memories sprinted through his mind, from the first time he had seen the Dornish princess to the last and every time in between. Something snapped in Aelor at that moment, his fists clenching as he stood to his full height, face no longer a man's, replaced by the feral savagery of a dragon. "I'm going to burn them all," he said, voice low but clear. "I'm going to burn them all." The storm that shook the eastern coast of Westeros that night seemed to give tidings of what was to come. The wind blew Barristan Selmy's cloak wildly, the thundering rain singing as it forcefully beat against his white armor. Twice he had to wrestle his horse back under control after the palfrey spooked at a loud clap of thunder, eyes white with terror, and he'd had to shout at the gate guard from less than a foot away to be heard. It was truly a shit time to be riding, but Barristan had a mission. It wasn't given to him by a member of the royal family, but instead his own conscience and a fear for the man he thought of as a son. Aelor was no longer Aelor. He hadn't done anything drastic yet, but Barristan knew the man better than anyone, and Aelor Targaryen was no longer in his right mind. Barristan knew as well as anyone the eccentrics that could come with the Targaryen name, having seen it firsthand during the reign of Aerys. But Aelor had always had his head set firmly on his shoulders, never showing the madness that so often manifested in his family. Aelor had been the brilliant side of the Targaryen coin, except for in his blackest rages. In those, even the dragon of Duskendale was unstable. His battle rages were different, those brought on by adrenaline and the need to protect his loved ones, and those didn't worry Barristan the Bold. But the other type. The type that Aelor let fester and grow until his life's goal became the destruction of whatever he had centered that rage on. Those concerned the Knight of the Kingsguard. He'd had that hatred for Robert Baratheon, and he had gotten his satisfaction by killing the man in the ford, but this new rage didn't seem to be focused on just Tywin Lannister. No, it seemed to be focused on the Lannister name in general, and that terrified Barristan. Aelia's death had come at the worst possible time. While Barristan was devastated to learn of the Dornish woman's murder, and would be the same under any circumstance. The blow it dealt Aelor so soon after the death of his brother and lifelong friend could not be underestimated. The second son of Aerys had dropped into the blackest rage Barristan had seen, the very name Lannister making the prince clench his fists and grit his teeth. The Red Viper was by no means helping, Oberyn in his own anger at his sister's murder calling for the head of every Lannister they could find, even those currently serving in the Loyalist army. Aelor had denied him so far, but Barristan knew. Barristan knew it was only a matter of time before Aelor's fury and anguish would make him buckle to the Prince of Dorne's insistence, and then even Sir Kevan, who was innocent of everything except being Tywin's brother, wouldn't be safe. That is why Barristan was riding in the middle of the night in a raging storm. Aelor may be able to save his family from his father's damages, but he couldn't save himself from his own anger. That fell to Barristan, and the Knight of the Kingsguard could only pray that Aelor would someday forgive him. Sir Kevan's tent was in the middle of the Westermen, its flaps latched down against the raging storm but with light from candles or a lantern inside casting shadows on its walls. There were Nog guards posted, what with the war thought to be over and the army merely waiting for Aelor to bid them leave to go, so Barristan reached the flap unopposed, slapping his hand against the canvas quickly. It took several moments for Sir Kevan to untie the flaps and usher him in, moments that felt like lifetimes to Barristan. As soon as he stepped into the dry, noticing several other men seated in the large tent who could from their looks only be Lannisters, he whirled back towards Sir Kevan. "You need to go, my lord." Kevan furled a brow. "Go. Your brother and nephew escaped the Black Cells with the help of Pycelle. They have gone to the Westerlands to raise the remaining men there." Kevan's face grew even more confused, trying to make sense of what Barristan was saying. "Jaime, he was wounded defending." Barristan cut him off, voice betraying the urgency of his words. "No, he wasn't, and there isn't time to explain." Barristan reached out to place his hands on Kevan's shoulders, staring him in the face as he spoke to make sure the Lannister knight knew the implications of what he was saying. Tywin had Elia Mardell killed. He tried to do the same to King Aegon and Princess Rhaenys but was stopped. Aelor is out of his mind with grief and anger, and Oberyn is no better. They want blood, Lannister blood. Kevan stepped back in shock. "But we here have served faithfully." "I know that, and somewhere deep inside so does Aelor, or you'd be dead already. But until Tywin is brought to justice, no Lannister is safe. For the love of the Seven, Kevan, flee. Return to your family and take them somewhere far away from all of this until it is over, until Aelor is himself again." "My brother killed an innocent woman and tried to kill her small children, one an infant. Nothing you can do will save Tywin, Kevan. He has sealed his own fate. The only thing you can do is hide your family until all of this is over. When Tywin is dead, Aelor may be able to see sense again, but until then you must run." Barristan turned to the other Lannister men who were in varying steps of standing up. "Run, all of you. Take your families and hide. Go now." To their credit, they needed no more prompting, Kevan and the others scrambling to obey. Barristan watched them as they pulled on boots and grabbed swords before rushing out of the tent, horses neighing even over the massive storm as they were hastily saddled and kicked into action, riding out into the whirling winds and rain. Barristan calmly remounted his own palfrey as soon as Sir Kevan was gone, turning it to anxiously trot back towards the city of King's Landing. He could only hope his actions hadn't just cost him his head. Aelor's rage was terrifying to behold, but it certainly made things happen quickly. The Dragon of Duskendale was the obvious choice as Aegon's regent, all agreed, and in that capacity he was moving quickly. Everyone knew it was solely so he could pursue the Lannisters sooner. But none were complaining, as more was getting done in a few days than normally got done in a few months. Aegon Targaryen, the sixth of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, had been crowned 2 days after Aelor's arrival. There had been no grand ceremony, no feast, no nothing. Merely a heavy guard of 50 men-at-arms and 3 Kingsguard knights escorting a carriage through the wind-blown streets in a steady rain. The strong winds from the hours before having subsided but leaving debris scattered across the wet streets. Inside that carriage, the King of the Seven Kingdoms had slept in the arms of Ashara Dane, oblivious to what was around him, his sister Rhaenys squirming restlessly in her uncle Aelor's lap. The toddler, unlike her brother, was fully aware of Elia's absence, having developed enough of a vocabulary in the months Aelor had been gone to repeatedly ask after Mama. It had broken the Targaryen prince's heart each time, increasing his rage at the Lannisters with each syllable. He was truly going to kill them all. Every last one. A few lords had grumbled that a great council was necessary, the implication clearly to crown Aelor Targaryen instead of the baby Aegon, but all whispering had stopped when the Dragon of Duskendale had caught wind of it. He'd reacted violently, informing the lords and ladies gathered in King's Landing that Aegon was king and would remain so, stating in no uncertain terms that he would remove the tongue of anyone who suggested otherwise. It was King Aerys-esque, but also superbly effective. No more whispers were heard. The rebellious Lord Paramounts had sworn fealty to the infant king soon after the simple coronation, though their intent to depart afterwards was postponed. Each had sworn the remnants of their men to Aelor and the Loyalist army, to track down and defeat the murderous Lannister. There was an underlying current of hope that good service in the coming battles would result in a diminution of the already lenient reprimands made, though whether or not it would happen even Aelor hadn't decided on. The small council had been chosen quickly, only missing a master of ships, whom Aelor claimed to have chosen already but hadn't given the name, and a Grand Maester, soon to be chosen by the conclave at the Citadel. Pycelle's head now rested on a spike along the walls of the Red Keep, joined by those of the other 8 Lannister men responsible for Elia Martell's murder. The old man's death had been carried out by the dead queen's brother Oberyn, and Barristan could only suppose it had been agonizingly slow. Bronze Yohn Royce had been appointed Master of Laws, a gesture intended to start binding the wounds in the realm the war had torn open. The Lord of Runestone was highly competent and respected, as well as a suitable man for the duty, and it proved that Aelor didn't intend for any bad blood to remain between the once opposing forces. Barristan himself was standing in for Lord Commander Gerald Hightower on the small council, his sworn brother still with the Stark girl in Dorne. Lord Wyman Manderley, already portly and likely to become much more so, had been appointed the Master of Coin. The Lord of White Harbor seemed much more shrewd and capable than Barristan's original impression of the man, and his family's devotion to both the Starks and the faith of the Seven made his presence both signifying and prudent. Varys had retained the role of Master of Whisperers, his circle of contacts and the power he could wield invaluable, though Aelor clearly held the Spymaster partly responsible for the Lannister men's infiltration. The Spider had partially made up for it by placing most of his assets into tracking the movements of the Western Bannermen, giving the Loyalist crucial information concerning who had received ravens, who hadn't, and who was obeying them. To a man, the early reports indicated they all were. There is nothing he can do, surely he must see that, Bronze Yohn was saying. We have nearly 60,000 men outside of the city, with 15,000 more finishing the siege of Storm's End. At best Lannister can raise 30,000, and that is a stretch. His retinue, half of his lords and their retinues, all either died in this very city or currently serve us. Can their loyalty be trusted? Asked Manderley, his chair pushed farther from the table than the others to account for his belly. As much as yours can, Lord Treasurer. Varys gestured towards the window of the small council chambers. Half of the men outside were not so long ago fighting the other half. My liege lord bent the knee to the Targaryen name and bid me serve them, Manderley shot back. The Manderleys owe the Starks a debt we cannot hope to repay, and as such I will serve where told until the day I die. I believe you, Lord Manderley, Aelor stated calmly from the head of the table. Our war is done, the reprimand's lenient. I hold knowledge of Lord Stark's sister's whereabouts, and the men who harmed his family so are dead. He is with us. And Lord Royce and his liege lord are the same. Tully by default is with us as well, as he is too closely tied to the others to join Tywin on his own. He glanced at Barristan ever so briefly before returning his gaze to the men surrounding the table before him. The men of Lannister blood have all fled, but their soldiers remain behind. They will not forsake us. They are already on the favorable side. The other lords follow Tywin Lannister because of fear. Lord Varys chimed in. Fear is a great motivator. And after the Rayans and Tarbecks, all of the Western lords are too afraid for their houses to dither from Lord Tywin's command. The Dragon of Duskendale looked to another man at the table, grim-faced and stern. Randall Tarly didn't hold a traditional seat on the small council, but Aelor seemed to have created one for him, having repeatedly referred to the Lord of Hornhill as Chief General, making it clear that supreme command of the Loyalist force should Aelor fall would pass directly to the balding Reachman. It was a prudent move, Barristan knew, rewarding the Reach with a spot on the small council as well as selecting a man born for the role. Tarly was as adept at tactics as Aelor was at swordplay. Lord Tarly, what do you suggest? The grim man stood, leaning over the table slightly to rest his finger on the red flag representing the seat of House Lannister. According to both the captured letter and Varys' spies, Lannister is rallying troops at Casterly Rock. He knows he is outnumbered, but he also knows he has no choice but to fight on after Queen Alia's death, so fight he shall. The mountains and hills of the Westerlands give them a defensive advantage, one I am sure Lannister will use. What is your suggestion? Our army is mustered and ready to move, giving us time Lannister doesn't have. All we need is to gather enough supplies to feed our men, and I already have convoys traveling through the Reach for that purpose. Tarly moved his finger away from Casterly Rock, placing it on King's Landing. I suggest a two-pronged attack. The main force of 45,000 will travel down the Gold Road like so, subduing Deep Den and any other castles necessary along our path. He slid his finger along the intended route as he spoke. A second force of 15,000 will enter the Westerlands here. This time he gestured towards where the Westerlands bordered with the Riverlands west of Riverrun. The Golden Tooth has a stout defense, but the Raven the big Kingsguard knight killed bore the message to them, so they will be lagging behind the others, and a force of mostly cavalry could reach them in time to assault before they are prepared. Once the flanking force is through, the main force will engage Tywin in the flats surrounding Casterly Rock and Lannisport, allowing the flankers to descend on him from another direction. Bronze Yohn, a decent tactician in his own right, nodded his approval. It will be similar to the Battle of the Trident where your Dornish men forded farther upriver and came in on our rear. Tarly nodded curtly. Lannister will be caught on two sides, and in the flats his defensive advantage will be gone. There is one setback, however. Lannister is smart, deadly smart, and once he realizes the battle is lost he will likely pull a chunk of his forces back into Casterly Rock. Any attack on that castle would be suicide, even if we had 600,000 men. It has never been taken before, and for good reason. And Lannister is too smart to be drawn away from his true advantage, Barristan agreed. Even if we don't reach him in time to catch him in the flats, he will only venture far enough to ambush us in the hills of the Westerlands, all the while maintaining a clear line of retreat back to his seat of power. Our numerical advantage can be countered. Tarly spoke only to Aelor then. Decisive action is required, your grace. It will be like then Stormlands again, your grace, Barristan said. Try to remove the lion's claws before they can sink into you. Aelor stared into the map, eyes unfocused in thought. Lord Tarly will have command of the main force, as is his place as chief general. I will lead the flanking force. Lord Royce, Lord Manderly, I will need both of your assistance in selecting the strongest knights and horsemen from the Northern Vale. My own best men were wiped out at the ford. Send word to Lord Tully to do the same. Aelor gestured to Storm's End. I will send Lord Eddard Stark and Lord Clayton Byitch with 1,000 men to lift the siege of Storm's End. Hopefully Stark can talk some sense into Stannis Baratheon, for Renly's sake if nothing else. Once done, Lord Mace will have orders to march to the Westerlands post-haste to reinforce our armies there. Lannister is outnumbered but certainly not beaten, and I will not lose him due to being overconfident. It went unsaid that Stark had other business to conclude afterwards in Dorne, though Barristan suspected every man present was aware. When do we leave, Prince Aelor? Tarly asked, ever focused on the task at hand. 3 days. That will give me time to select the best riders as well as settle things here in King's Landing. Lord Randall nodded. With the prince's permission I will begin preparations immediately. Aelor waved his hand and Tarly swiftly exited the room. Lord Royce, the city watch is in shambles after Lannister's raid. Your first duty as Master of Laws is to reorganize and resupply the men, though your choices are momentarily restricted due to the army's proximity to departure. Sir Manly Stokeworth, the former commander, was killed in the sack, and there hasn't been true time to select a successor since. Promote internally for now, though the 7 know what caliber of men you have to choose from. We will focus on rebuilding the Goldcloaks as soon as Lannister is subdued. Lord Royce nodded, rising to his impressive height. It will be done, your grace. Aelor turned to Manderly as Royce followed Tarly's footsteps out of the door. Lord Carlton Chelsted, your successor, displeased my father and lost his life for it. That leaves you, Lord Wyman, in a difficult position, as no one has a notion of where our finances lay, and it is your job to find out. Your duty is more difficult than even Lord Royce's, though I trust you are more than capable. Lord Eddard spoke highly of you, and you may recruit as much assistance as you need. Lord Manderly nodded and rose, grasping quickly that the meeting was over and this was his dismissal. I will begin at once, your grace. The portly man smiled knowingly. I will consider any debts owed to House Lannister as soon to be paid. Aelor grinned ever so slightly. I do believe you will thrive here, Lord Wyman. Lord Varys had risen with Manderly. I will continue listening for the song of my little birds, Prince Regent. The Westerlands are alive with their music. Both men, portly northerner and bald eunuch, exited the chamber. Barristan found himself alone with the prince. The Knight of the Kingsguard had made no secret of what he had done, informing Aelor the next morning of his actions. The prince had said nothing, though the betrayal in his eyes had torn into Barristan's soul. The fact that Aelor had yet to move, coupled with the tenseness that had seeped into his shoulders, suggested to Barristan Selmy that the prince intended to discuss it now. Go ahead, your grace. To Barristan's surprise, Aelor merely looked at him for a moment, his voice calm as ever when he began to speak. I don't think I will, Barristan. You betrayed me, warning Kevin Lannister and his blonde cunt cousins that I was going to kill them when I had made no such action. Yet, Aelor shot to his feet. Who are you to judge the dragon? They killed Aaliyah, yet you allow them to run. Need I remind you that you serve House Targaryen, not House Lannister? Or are you a treacherous snake like fucking Pycelle? Barristan kept his voice calm. They didn't kill Aaliyah, Tywin did. Sir Kevin fought loyally for you, as did his kinsmen present. I serve House Targaryen and House Targaryen only. Aelor, you know that. Do I? The prince's voice was calming, though the enraged and Barristan's realized in horror, crazed, glint in his violet eyes did not vanish. 2 of my brothers are dead, one of blood and one of choice. My household knights and retinues, friends all, are to a man dead. The woman I loved was stabbed to death for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as well as for marrying the wrong Targaryen. And my father, the one I chose, not the one who sired me, allowed the men who killed her to flee. Aelor shook his head. Tell me, what in this life do I truly know anymore? Barristan found his heart being shredded at the prince's words. Aelor, Sir Kevin, is a Lannister, the prince spat. Barristan could only watch him as the prince stood straighter. You will remain here when we march to guard King Aegon and Princess Rhaenys alongside Sir Arthur Dayne. Sir Manfred will accompany me on the campaign. The Knight of the Kingsguard instantly felt a jab of concern, not only for the prince's life but also for what he may do were Barristan not there to restrain him. My place is with you, Aelor. The dragon of Duskendale's voice was as cold as the tendrils of fear growing in Barristan Selmy's stomach. Your place is where the king deems fit. As his regent, I deem it to be here. Aelor walked towards the door, leaving his mentor to watch after him in torment, only pausing under its frame to toss one more comment over his shoulder. Do not enter my presence again unless called for, Sir Barristan. Without another word, his son walked through the door.